potentially be live now. Give it a few minutes just to see what's going on. See if people show up in the chat. Is that a picture of your family in the top right? Big picture.
It's my grandfather and two nieces.
Cool. You have a lot of books.
I sell books,
Oh yeah.
supplement income on eBay. The books on my shelf are books that I read and keep, but I also sell books. I have eBay, also doooovid with four O's.
Nice. All right. We looks like we have people in the chat now. So that's not what I wanted. Doovid, thanks for coming online. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I'm doovid, David Kelton here in Metro Detroit. I'm a civil engineer. I manage a few properties. I've studied a lot of things. I studied in Jerusalem in religious schools. I'd be referred to as what they call a bal tshuva, meaning that I grew up a secular Jew and then became Orthodox, but I studied in mainstream Orthodox schools in Jerusalem and then Hasidic schools in Brooklyn. I created a YouTube page about 10 years ago, largely to promote Judaism, teach people like the basics of how to chant Hebrew, things, what to do at synagogue. But I also got affiliated with the Hare Krishnas when I was at University of Michigan. So I put a lot of that on my YouTube page. In fact, I went to school with Siddhart at University of Michigan, who you debated against. We used to talk about theology. And then a few years ago, I ran to Luke Ford in Hollywood, interesting character who is a convert to Orthodox Judaism. Used to be a, God forbid, porn reporter, but however that worked out, he bought me a microphone and set me up in live streaming, and I got into debating, mostly counter Semites. Luke had been on the Warski show with JF back when that happened, and so I was kind of explaining Judaism, and then I ended up debating JF because like I was telling people like I don't believe in evolution, and I was arguing against atheism, and I ended up debating JF on evolution, and from there I've kind of turned myself into a internet personality, doing different things. I found Church of Entropy Jennifer, who I guess working together with you now. Actually, she found me, and we had enough agreement that we ended up working together. So we've been doing a show for almost 3 years now, Week in Review, talking about consciousness, spirituality, scientific issues. I've seen a lot of your debates, like I guess one of the things I specialize in debating against atheism. So I helped Jennifer prepare for your debate, and I guess you were on the AMA that Jennifer set up on a Discord. I love consciousness. Like I said, I sell books. My degree's in civil engineering, but I tried to minor in linguistics and physics and psychology. And the hard problem of consciousness has been the main focus of my thought, even though not professionally. So that's basically all I think about. I spend all my spare time reading the issue, from evolutionary medical textbooks about neuroscience to spiritual theories, mainstream, Vedic and Judaic, theories, to more spiritual, esoteric um, things. I've been following the Hammerov Science of Consciousness conference for a few years now.
Cool. You said you debated JF on evolution. What was that debate on? What was the actual topic? Is evolution true or something?
Yeah, I mean, he took the affirmative, and it was on his channel. It went over 3 hours. It's still up on BitChute. He took it down from YouTube a few years ago. God forbid the guest the following night was David Duke, and his YouTube channel didn't last, but it was pretty interesting. We went. My main focus of argument was consciousness. So the first hour was largely whether materialism could explain consciousness. And then I argued some of the mainstream talking points that anti-evolution people argued, whether life could come from life, in terms of like the initial life, whether evolution violates the rules of entropy. Um, some of the normal arguments, but I think my specialty in arguing against evolution is that evolution uh, doesn't properly explain consciousness.
Okay. And you said one of your specialties is debating atheists. I am, of course, am an atheist, so I believe that everything is best explained by naturalism without a god. Could you tell me what reasons you believe there is to believe in a god? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on my responses to those.
Well, I say you're one of the bigger atheists out there. I don't know if you're like Richard Dawkins level, or if you have like JF actually has a PhD in biology, but you're definitely one of the bigger atheists out there. I've seen many of your debates. I said I prepped Jennifer for the debate with you, on Week in Review, and we even did streams on. I taught her the flowing method and various things, and I told her, actually I thought you ran about even in that debate, or but I don't think you can necessarily prove that the soul, or to like a scientific standard to have definitive answers. But I would say the explanatory power of atheism, which would probably lead into materialism. If I debated Ben Watkins, who I think you're friends with also, on two times whether there's evidence of the soul or whether materialism could explain consciousness. So I would say, like, I mean, I can't hit like a whammy that disproves atheism, but my approach is more for people to examine their own mind, introspection, and to think whether the phenomena of consciousness is more likely to arise from the physical, the brain, or from some separate spiritual realm. So that's my main form of argumentation.
So, why would you think that consciousness would be more likely to arise or be explained by a spiritual realm? Because to me, it seems like because we have lots and lots of evidence of the material stuff, but we seemingly have no evidence of the spiritual stuff, it's much more reasonable to say that the consciousness is a combination of the material stuff. Like if we see a footprint in the snow, it's more likely to say that's probably caused by a horse because we have lots of evidence that horses exist somewhere on the planet. Whereas if someone said it's a unicorn, that doesn't make any sense because there's no evidence of unicorns anywhere on the planet. So it would always be better to prioritize the horse explanation, and materialism seems to work the same way. If we have some phenomenon we can't explain, like consciousness or dark matter, dark energy, whatever, it's more plausible to say that it's a combination of the things that we've already verified to exist, rather than to say it's a added new thing that has no evidence for it, like spirituality kind of stuff.
Well, I take two approaches to this. One would be, what to consider the default hypothesis. And I say historically, dualism, a spiritual realm, uh, was the default hypothesis from, like a historical survey. I think almost all of the great minds till 200 years ago, almost all explained consciousness, Judaic training, um, the text and the understanding of the ritual, going back from the sages thousands of years ago, let alone even mainstream Western philosophers, was that the mind arose from a separate realm, and atheism, really only comes around in the last 200 years, I guess, but maybe Laplace and the meeting Napoleon, and
Well, I mean, I technically I agree, like, but there's for the majority of human history, the flat Earth was technically the starting position too. So, but why would that make it the fact that it was the starting position by people who were uneducated in the past? Why would that be relevant to what we should start with today? Now that we know more.
well, so I don't necessarily think that we do know more, and then to explain the phenomenon of what we all individually experience, that the explanations of the sages, like, if you're uh, you come from a tradition, Christian, Judaic, or even the philosophers, Greek, or Western Enlightenment, that had workings of the mind, even something like Freud, that had explanations for how the mind worked, that were not based on neurology, weren't based on the brain. They were based on introspection and psychometric results, psychometric testing, and in largely sages that claim that they had some sort of revelation. And so if you look at the explanatory power of a model of consciousness, say, what is this that's going on inside of our heads? And then you look at the ancient models or the religious models, bless you,
Thank you.
The religious models of consciousness that they, at least, my mind, maybe other people's minds, intuitively make more sense with the phenomenon than what the science says. And I studied science. Like I wasn't good enough in math to get a degree in physics. I tried to major in physics. I took, I was pre-med. I've taken quite a bit. I read medical textbooks, even maybe an hour a day. I love that stuff. But to have an accurate measure of what does materialism say, what is the current state of theories of mind. And I was talking with Jennifer last night in Week in Review. I was saying that from my understanding, the materialist explanations actually are proposing that consciousness and mind doesn't exist. And I would say that atheism, and we could argue this if you want, whether atheism implies mechanistic determinism or your views on free will or such matters, but a materialistic explanation of consciousness, um, from my understanding, and obviously there's a hard problem with consciousness, and there's not really any definitive theories of consciousness on the scientific market, so to say, but that it would be mechanistic determinism, and most of the theories are actually saying that consciousness doesn't exist, that there's some sort of illusion in our mind, and like would be an automaton that would be just responding to stimulus, and this perception in our mind that maybe we have of there being a definitive separate controller or decision maker that decides is not actually how neuroscience and the materialist theoreticians. You've had some big names on your channel. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Stephen Grossberg, Boston University. His resonance theory. I just ordered his book. It's supposed to come today. But of these mainstream theories, I think that they're basically a rejection of consciousness, not an explanation of it.
In the theistic sense, for sure, because the theistic sense, there's like consciousness is this thing that actually does stuff, whereas in the materialistic sense, it's more just a single phenomenon. It doesn't actually necessarily do anything. So in that sense, yeah, most of the theories think that the spiritual kind of libertarian consciousness doesn't exist, for sure. But I'm still not seeing why that would be a better theory, because again, we have lots of evidence of material stuff, lots of science. All science is based on material interactions of some kind. And we don't have anything, as far as I can tell, that indicates the spiritual realm or non-science stuff. And the things that you brought up were people in the past used to use it as the baseline, which I don't think is good evidence. They had revelation, which isn't good evidence. The religious models make more intuitive sense, which isn't good evidence. Like the Thor model made more intuitive sense to people about lightning that wasn't evidence of Thor. I don't think atheism implies determinism, just naturalism does. But even naturalism doesn't necessarily imply determinism. But I'm not seeing any of those things you said. None of them seem to stack up to the evidence that is on the naturalist side. That, oh, look at all these novel predictions we can make about all this stuff in science that build computers and spaceships and things, and all of this stuff we can do in the natural world with this material ontology that we've discovered. It's a pretty good basis that this is everywhere. We see it everywhere, whatever it is. But we don't see any of the spiritual stuff anywhere. And the only evidence you've presented is people in the past used to use it as a baseline. There's intuition, and that's about it. I don't see anything else. Or you mentioned psychometric testing. I don't know what that is.
Just the output of the mind. I was saying the mind, I was saying yesterday, if you look from I was saying the scientific default position is mechanistic determinism. And you could be an atheist or a materialist that doesn't believe in mechanistic determinism, but say if that's the default position, and I would say the default position is that the mind and consciousness doesn't actually exist, at least from the materialistic perspective, but we have psychometric output. Like, you could play a game of chess, we could talk math problems, you could do memory tests, the science of expertise, that whether we have a mind or consciousness or the origin of it doesn't change the fact that there's measurable uh, output of the mind, called psychometric data, going back to like the behavioralists 100 plus years ago. And I would push back and say that science does not, there is really no evidence of a theory of mind from the materialism. There's what we call the neural correlates of consciousness that demonstrate that there's activity in the brain that corresponds to thought. There's lesion studies. I showed last week. I read the book of the scientific studies of Wiesel and Hubel, who God forbid, would probably wouldn't be allowed anymore. They did these experimental tests on cats and monkeys where they had testing their data and stuck sensors on their brain. Like, God forbid, they probably opened up their head and stuck sensors on like the brains of cats while they tested them. But that's really all we have is these neural correlates of consciousness, and there is no working theory of mind consciousness on the market in terms of like the heart. Ergo JF mentioned, we have a complete model of how the heart pumps oxygens. You could create a computer simulates that would completely model how the heart works. There is no such thing for how the brain produces mind. And I would say that the evidence of the neural correlates of consciousness would work just as well with a dualistic theory as the brain as a receiver from a spiritual realm. They say the brain isn't producing consciousness, the brain is receiving consciousness from some sort of separate realm. And that's why parts of the brain light up, or when there's lesions in parts of the brain, that it has a defect in certain amounts of ability. But I would say that there's absolutely zero evidence, or in terms of an actual theory of how the brain produces consciousness. And you look at computers and just assume that like computer circuitry could produce, so to say, intelligence of some sort, that people hypothesize that maybe the brain through these electrical circuits work in a similar way to a computer, although there's factually basically zero evidence of that.
So from my perspective, that just sounds like an argument from ignorance. It's like, oh look, science hasn't made a theory to explain this unknown phenomenon, therefore my hypothesis is true. Like your, for the idealist and dualist perspective, seems to be equally as nothing. There's no theory or explanation of consciousness there either. They just say, oh, it's a thing that exists that we can't explain yet. But it seems like if
they've been working on it. They've been working on it for over 100 years. Scientists have been, thinking they were going to solve this, going back, well over 100 years, and currently there's zero theory that is testable for how the brain produces consciousness. The only thing that they have is like, oh, if there's a lesion or an injury, or that lights, that and something light up when people think something like that. But that's not a theory of consciousness, and it's saying that it's been 100 years people have been working on this. Steven Grossberg now, like, he first started writing his books in the 80s.
I don't know why the number of years matters. Still,
well, I said that it's not like, I would say that if you looked at it, they say the brain, they're not going to figure out how the brain produces consciousness. It's not there. They've been looking for a long time. And that's my take on it. I mean, you agree from your research that there is no current reasonable scientific theory of how the brain produces consciousness. There's
sure.
No, like,
but that's still like an argument from ignorance. Even if we worked on it for 10 million years, the fact that the scientific route didn't discover anything isn't evidence against it. It's just evidence that we don't know what it is yet. Because the same thing's true under the idealists. The idealists have been trying to explain consciousness for thousands of years, and they've made no progress either. So we would still need some new methodology that actually counts as evidence to indicate one way or the other. And right now, all that you're presenting is that science hasn't discovered anything yet. I mean, sure, but neither have you. So that doesn't.
Well, it's my bias because I studied a tradition that has an alternative explanation. So I was saying that I'm going to go with the so to say the explanation of my religion, that consciousness arises from some sort of separate spiritual realm, and the essential I is not my body and survives death.
Sure, but what's the difference
so
here?
That may not be scientific, but okay, my bias in rejecting evolution or that consciousness arises from the brain is because it contradicts my belief tradition, and so I'll admit that bias.
Well, sure, but you mentioned like the reason that materialism isn't supported is because there's no working model or working theory, but there's also no working model under dualism or idealism too. All of the work that's been put into science to try to discover it and hasn't come up with anything also hasn't worked for the dualists or the idealists either. So the same criticisms you're bringing against the scientific model seem to also apply to your model. You just like it better. So I'm not, because again, I'm still seeing the fact that if we look at all the past evidence we have in the world, we know material stuff exists. We don't have evidence of spiritual stuff. So it's always going to be better to say that any new undiscovered thing, even if we don't have any model for it whatsoever, no matter how long we've been working on it, is going to be a combination of the known things rather than a completely unknown thing that we have no evidence for. So I don't see the criticisms you brought up against materialism as being relevant because they also apply to your own model. Like, we would need some kind of positive evidence of your model, not just saying that, well, neither side has a working model.
Well, I say I have a somewhat working model. If I just said the classical understanding of the sages of Judaism, and so it's like, okay, I'm a practicing Jew. I do, years of my life I spent more than 2 hours a day praying and chanting, and I do rituals, and I have the text of the sages that explain how this stuff operates, and the explanation is largely dualistic in the sense that there's some sort of cause effect relationship, if you want to use the word karma, and that karma is manifested uh, through the spiritual realm, not the material realm. And from that perspective, I say that the mind, not being material, the mind sees the spiritual realm in the same way that it sees the material realm. So I have to have an alternative understanding of what we're observing. So saying that from the materials perspective, there's only one world and one thing to observe, and the alternative model, which I'll call the default type, like as so to say an Orthodox Jew, for me that's my default hypothesis, is that there's two concurrent realms, a spiritual and physical realm, and certain things that we observe don't exist in the material realm, exist in the spiritual realm. And say, like, can we prove that? It's largely from introspection or evidential to a given person of what explains the phenomenon better, what has better explanatory power to have two separate realms, and then to differentiate what is in the realm of the material and what is in the realm of the spiritual.
Well, so how do you show, because you said this is a somewhat working model. Why would this count as a somewhat working model more so than the naturalist ones? And you said it explains the phenomenon better. How does it explain the phenomenon better? Because it seems to me like you've just made up an idea. You say, I like this idea, and the fact that I like it better is what makes it more working or explains the phenomenon better. It's simply just you like it, and that seems to be the only criterial difference between the two models. I don't see, like, what else can you use to substantiate the claim that one is a better working model or has better explanatory power or whatever.
I don't claim to have made up anything in saying that. I would argue basically the standard Judeo-mystical, Kabbalistic, Hasidic conception of mind. Like I could list, I the Talmud behind me. I studied in Hebrew schools for years. I could list, probably, a bunch of rabbis or sages that majority of people never heard of. There
Well,
might
right,
be
right. Just to clarify, I
people
don't
who
mean
people who disagree that I'm not correctly giving over
right.
the
Just to
Judaic
clarify, I didn't
conception
mean
of
I didn't
mind.
mean you literally. I didn't mean like you literally made up all these ideas. I meant that when we're differentiating theories, we want to know, is it imaginary, something somebody just made up in their head, and this would apply to anybody. So when I say you here, it just means any human being just made this up in their head, kind of a thing. So the question is, how do you differentiate this made up idea in somebody's head as working better or having more explanatory power or explains the phenomenon better than the scientific ones? Now, everything is all made up. They all start in somebody's head. But it seems like the science ones are better because all of the parts of that have been demonstrated to exist outside of people's heads, whereas none of the parts of the spiritual thingy have been demonstrated to exist outside of people's heads. Therefore, it seems like this model that you've presented is just something somebody made up in their head, but you're claiming that this model is a better working model. I want to know, how is this a better working model? What is the criteria that we establish this is a better working model than the materialist one?
Explanatory power. And so, like, I argue with majority non-Jews, people not familiar with the Hebrew sages. I'm a big fan of the Greeks and Aristotle and Plato. In fact, Maimonides, the famous scholar who was influential in Thomas Aquinas, was a big fan of Aristotle, claiming that Aristotle reached the highest level a man could reach under prophecy. But in terms of our discussion, I would base it purely on explanatory power, that we both observe certain phenomenon and could agree that this is the phenomenon we're witnessing, and then to give some sort of model that explains the phenomenon, and say that some sort of dualistic model where it's like, no, it's not coming from our head. This conversation that we're having right now, the thoughts that me or you are thinking, or even the controller of ourself, does not derive from our head. It derives from a separate realm, call it the spiritual realm, and it has nothing to do with our head. That the interaction of the spiritual and material realm might happen in our brain, but in terms of our discussing it and providing evidence, we would have to look at the explanatory power of the conflicting hypothesis.
And how does what's the difference between explanatory power in the dualistic model and the materialist one? Because I'm not, how does one have more explanatory power here than another? I'm not understanding.
So for Ben Watkins, I went through a few different things. We even talked about the science of laughter, and I'm not sure if you've studied laughter much. You actually seem more my personality type, that hardly ever laughs, not much of a sense of humor. But you're trying to explain the phenomenon of laughter, and it's actually very difficult. There's much dispute among scientists, neuroscientists, about the origins of laughter. And Aristotle historically says that laughter arises from the soul, and that a child doesn't laugh until his soul enters the body. But even that, say laughter is triggered by thought, and that what's the nature of something that you could say something intellectual, something that doesn't involve, so to say, the material realm, but of something intellectual, but that would trigger some sort of physical reaction. And if you haven't done the research into laughter, or could think of what models right now explain how the mechanism of laughter works, but there's one interesting phenomenon. Usually I like to argue karma, and if someone like Ben Watkins or JF, or JF is a nihilist, or Ben Watkins, I guess, is like a neo-Hegelian, but is saying that karma factually doesn't exist, that there is no arc of justice in the
I'm getting lost a bit. So uh, you're saying that one has more explanatory power. Why? It seems like you intuitively feel it's better, but that seems to be the only criterion that establishes which has more explanatory power. Like, what is your definition of explanatory power? How do we establish one theory has more explanatory power than another? What is the criterion of establishing explanatory power of two different theories?
Well, logic, reason, predictive power. To talk purely like we'll call scientific, of just logic, reason for understanding, is this a reasonable algorithmic mechanism of the phenomenon, or is it have predictive power for predicting how things are going to work? And if you say that the model is saying that the controller, that like me, doovid, or you, TJump, is not our body, that even though you think that you're your body, from my model, I'm saying like, no, you are not your body. The controller of your body that's producing these thoughts, and using your body to make the sound waves or whatever, is not actually coming from your body. And I would be a pure dualist and say not only the controller of the body is non-material, but that also the thought itself is non-material. That even if you think 1 + 1 = 2, or the conversation, the ideas we're thinking right now, I would also hypothesize that that's not occurring in our brain or on the material realm.
Okay,
And
so you
then,
said logic, reason, and predictive power. Now, predictive power doesn't seems materialism is the only thing that has any predictive power. I don't see any predictions made about soul stuff ever being confirmed. But what about logic or reason? So, how does the dualistic or idealistic model have an advantage over logically over the materialistic one?
well, I mean, because we're talking largely psychometric data. That's not something like physics, where we're not going to be able to take an object out and drop it or measure its speed and acceleration. We're talking about the product of mind, and the product of mind is ideas. So you would have to come up with some sort of conception of how do you measure the outcome of mind. And even if you're talking about just the fundamental question, is the controller material or immaterial? And saying the output, obviously the body is material, and but to measure the controller, the controller is really a product of mind. So you'd have to be measuring some sort of outcome of the ability to self-control the human body, and then look at the explanation for what makes more sense in terms of explanatory power of the controller of the body being part of the body, or coming from some separate realm outside of the body.
Well, that seems to be like begging the question, because that's the phenomenon we're trying to explain. So we have consciousness, we have the data of consciousness, and now we want to know, is this
Well, I told you
better?
that's not. I mean, that even according to the current theories that from a mechanistic determinist perspective, we don't have consciousness in mind. So I mean, if you're claiming as an atheist or a materialist that we have consciousness, that might actually put you in opposition to the leading neuroscience, who would say we don't actually have consciousness or mind, and that that's just the remnants of our ancient cultures of dualists who describe these things in these terms. But from the current scientific understanding, that consciousness and mind are anachronisms to a time when we believed in spirituality.
Well,
I
that's
mean, do
not.
you believe that we have consciousness or mind?
Yeah, I agree with the majority, the consensus of most people in neurology, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind, that consciousness does exist. I'm not an eliminativist. I don't
Are
think
you
that.
claiming that's the consensus of
Yeah,
them, that we do
because
have
I've
consciousness and
yeah
mind?
I have several polls on that, and I've spoken to several people in the field, like who is it, Julian Mussolino. Like, yeah, we agree consciousness is a thing for sure, but that doesn't answer the question. So the question is, we have this phenomenon, which is conscious experience, qualia, and we want to know why. We don't know what it's caused by. It's unknown, an unknown phenomenon. And you're saying that the dualist idealist model has an advantage on one of these explanatory
I mean, for the
power.
sake of argument, I mean, if I were to play the atheist and say, like, no, like we do not have consciousness in mind, that is not the consensus, and that the current scientific understanding of materialism, that there is no such thing as consciousness or mind, it's an illusion. And just look at the only field of consciousness studies is in the department of anesthesiology. In medicine, the only field where they even use the term consciousness is anesthesiology. There is no department of mind and consciousness in university. If you take it in philosophy, they don't talk about neuroscience. They talk about Aristotle and the ancients, who largely believed in dualism. So why would I give you a pass that says, as a materialist, you get to think that there is such a thing as consciousness or mind?
Because I have all the polls from all the materialists who say there is consciousness of mind, which is the majority of them.
Well, I mean, from like the Hammeroff conference.
I think that's one of them, but there's lots of these. Like, it's not uncommon. You can just go
Where's
ask. I talked
consciousness
with.
studied?
I have them all saved. There's listed in the Julian Mussolino conversation. They all agree consciousness is real. We talk about this in many of my things. It's the only a very small minority of
But not,
people
we
who
will say
thinks.
mind.
What?
Remember, consciousness is real in terms of anesthesiology, and that's the only field in medical science where there is such a thing as consciousness. But to say that
No,
mind is
there's
real,
so I mean, everyone says, yeah, consciousness is real. There's an extremely small number of people who say consciousness isn't real. They're the eliminativists. They're an extreme minority. We go over this with my conversation with Richard Brown. Almost nobody thinks that consciousness is an illusion. Even Dan Dennett, who like started this popular statement that consciousness is an illusion, didn't even mean it in that way, and he's misquoted as saying that. So yes, the vast majority of everyone working in this field who are materialists think consciousness is real. And you can go ask Richard Brown if you would like more info on that. That is not my topic. I don't
but that's
interested in it.
referring to like anesthesiology and the controller, not to mind. And to say that
Mind
mind
and
is,
brain are synonymous in this case. In materialists think mind and brain are synonymous. The consciousness itself does exist, and it's a product of the brain physically. But that's a separate topic. Like, if you want to talk about the consensus, go ask the consensus. My topic is yes, I'm a materialist. I say consciousness does exist. I'm experiencing it. It's a phenomenon. Now I want to know, I don't need to explain it. I don't need to explain it in any way. I can just say, I'm experiencing it. This thing I'm experiencing, I'm labeling this as consciousness. Now we don't know what the cause is. And you said dualism or idealism has more explanatory power, which means it has to have more of these three things: logic, reason, predictive power. But it doesn't seem to me it does. It seems like on the explanatory power side, materialism wins. It's logically better. It has definitively more predictive power, and it's significantly more reasonable. I would say that it's more logical because we have lots of evidence materialist stuff exists. And if you want to explain a phenomenon using combinations of things that we know exist is always better than adding in new things we don't have any evidence of. So if you want to say what caused the footprint in the snow, saying a horse did it is always more logical than saying a unicorn did it, because in order to justify that assertion that a unicorn did it, you need some independent evidence of unicorns first. Reasonable, same thing. It's better to say that materialism did it because we have lots and lots of evidence. Material stuff is everywhere. It is just ubiquitous everywhere in the universe. So it's saying it's caused this unknown phenomenon that's only in very parts of the universe, very small parts. Pretty reasonable to say, yeah, it's probably an unknown material thing. Predictive power, all of the predictive power is done by material stuff. We say, well, how do we change consciousness? Zap you in the brain in this spot. Yep, that's going to change consciousness. So all of the predictive power, all of the logic and reason, all of the criterion you established for explanatory power seem to win on the materialistic side. How do you think that dualism or idealism has an advantage in logic or reason?
Well, I think you make somewhat of a circular understanding because we're arguing about the origin and nature of mind. And so you'd have to separate what we're measuring by mind. And so, if I'm claiming that the mind doesn't exist in the material realm and exists in a separate spiritual realm, but we agree about this phenomenon of mind, that we're both talking about the same mind, and we're just disagreeing about its origins, but then we're using the mind to measure things. I mean, Jennifer, she had a hard time, I think, understanding. I was trying to explain her, so to say, objective, and it was actually one of your arguments where you were talking about objective and like the science of expertise in psychometric data. That what is the output of mind, and if we table, say, the issue we're talking about here is mind coming from the material or the spiritual, but we both agree that we're using the mind to measure this. So if you can't assume for your side of the argument that the mind is material, to say because there's mind, therefore it's material, when I'm using the same argument and saying the mind is spiritual and the mind observes material and spiritual things. So what we could agree about is psychometric data expertise that could be like you defined objective, that could be measured. Maybe that was with Claire Call, that absent of mind, like a computer and IQ test, typing speed, and even from that if we argue does mind even exist, that say even if mind doesn't exist, we could still measure, so to say, the output of what we would call mind, like how fast can you type, how well could you do on a math test, that you say it's your mind that's producing your typing speed, or your mind that's producing the results to intellectual questions. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense to you, to differentiate.
Well, I got lost at the beginning part where you said it's circular reasoning. So I'm not begging the question here. I'm saying, okay, so there's a phenomenon of qualia. We both agree that is a thing. And we want to know what causes...
The phenomenon of mind. I mean, if you're talking about sense perception,
yeah,
and I'm talking about mind
thoughts
in terms of thought, and even like in a Platonic ideal, that say, like, I would argue also that ideas don't exist in the material realm.
Right. So we have
like circles, triangles, categories are immaterial spiritual phenomena.
So we have the phenomenon of thoughts, which we can refer to as mind or qualia. There's a phenomenon of thoughts, and we want to know what is causing these phenomenon of thoughts. That's the question we're asking. And you said the criterion to do this is explanatory power. Which theory has more explanatory power, which is made up of logic, reason, and predictive power. Now, of those three, it seems like materialism wins on all of those. Now, I'm not begging the question here. I'm saying if I accept your criterion, we have the phenomenon, which is thoughts. And we want to explain what best explains the thoughts. Materialism seems to win because it has more predictive power. Like if I zap you in the brain, it's going to cause this change in consciousness. That's something was predicted accurately, and it happened. And that happens all the time.
How does that have any more explanatory power than the brain as a receiver. They say if the brain was a receiver as opposed to the producer of mind, why would any of these lesions or zaps or studies uh, produce a different result?
Because we can add and take away things in the brain.
Yeah, so saying the brain's a receiver that would produce the exact same result.
No, in a receiver, you have to tune the receiver. But in a brain, if you can literally just, like, if I can program something in a computer and add the thing I programmed to your brain isn't receiving it anymore. It's literally the thing in the computer. So, like, if
Yeah, but
I,
you don't have the code. I mean, that's why I said that the only evidence comes from like MRI, different forms of scans that
no,
show
no, no,
when people
like
think,
there's, you know
or
about genetic
legion
memory, right?
studies.
You know about genetic memory. Like, we can implant memories into things through genes and we can transfer those things from one brain to another brain. Like, we did that in snails recently. Where we took a memory from one brain and then we implanted that memory to another brain. It can't be a receiver anymore because we're just taking this
Well,
literal
memory is
physical
an
thing.
issue. It's like memory is not necessarily a product of mind, but in terms of thought, you can't do that with a thought. You can't create some sort of chip that will make someone understand calculus.
Uh, that seems to be like a memory. So we've done it
I
with.
took anatomy. I'm not sure, like your scientific background, to say there's substantial evidence that the brain electrically controls the action of the body, that sends signals that lead to action, although the origin of those impulses that cause the action is still unknown. And sense perception of that different senses all over the body, the
Well,
the
not,
cones.
you mentioned calculus. Like, calculus seems to be purely just a physical structure in the brain. If you have the correct physical structure, you will understand calculus.
Well, I was going to add memory, that it seems relatively, and even the memory evidence from the brain still isn't that strong. But it's that if you could implant some sort of memory through a biological device, that's not the same thing as thought. Memory and thought is not the same.
I see memories as a kind of thought, and so if you can implant a thought or
Memory is
memory.
just an observation. I'm saying memory is a sense. Memory is not thought. Memory is sense perception.
Okay,
That
so
like
let's
that
put it
if I
this way.
never saw you before, and then someone implanted in my brain, like a memory of you, and then I think that I've seen you before because that's there. It doesn't have anything to do with thought. It's just a false sense perception.
All right, so memories, which seem to be very closely related to thought, are clearly not a received thing. It's not a
Does
receiver
it
from some
show sense
outside thing.
perception implant of memory, or
What?
ideas where you could implant memories of ideas, or you could implant memories of sense perception?
Either one, fine, doesn't make a difference. The point here
What
is
makes a
that
huge difference in terms of
does not to my argument, makes no difference to my argument. So my argument here is that these memory things, which seem to be very closely related to thoughts, are fully explained by material gene memory, genetic memory. We can implant them, we can take them out, we can do whatever we want with them. This seems to be very, very closely related to thoughts, the thought thingies we're
I have to look
talking
at this
about.
data. I'm saying I mean, you're talking about memory, and if you're talking about the memory of sense perception versus memory of an idea.
It's both. Like, we can cause them to take an action. And when you get into this maze, you will find the correct path by memory. I think they're the same thing. So whether or not you accept that or not is irrelevant here. The point here is
Well, I have to see
that
the study, and if you're referring
that's
to
fine.
something that's actually
That's
been
fine.
done.
Yes, this is a study. It's been done in snails. It's genetic memory in snails. I have the paper somewhere in my Discord. It's in the paper section, I believe. So the point here is that we have this thing which is very closely related to the topic, and that's fully explained materialistically. And from that, it's reasonable to infer, even though we're just going into the very edges of thought here, just memory, which is something related but not necessarily the same. Because that is fully explained by materialistic stuff, we can infer that it's a better explanation to go with this materialistic explanation, even though we don't fully understand it. Whereas it seems like the only explanation or the only reason you have to accept yours is that you don't like it, you don't feel like naturalism is a better explanation. But, like, we actually have data, we're making progress in the field, we're making predictions, we have predictive power, and so logically and from a reasonable standpoint, it's reasonable to infer that this progress is going to continue, and we're going to eventually discover consciousness from some unknown
I
material
mean, a
means.
false pejorative that saying I'm going with the historical consensus of sages. You're going with the modern consensus of scientists and neurologists, and even on your own personal level, to so to say, you have a tradition, you have your ancestors, and even if you're going with the current consensus of this generation or maybe even the last few generations, that the overall historical consensus is still with dualism.
Well, I didn't say anything about consensus here. I just said here's the data. We make novel
You're giving a
predictions.
false pejorative that like I'm
False
purposely
pejorative.
rejecting the data in order to go with what I want, as opposed to saying that no, I'm just sticking
Oh,
with
oh, that was a
I'm sticking
question.
with
So,
I'm sticking with my sages and what I would say is the historical consensus. And one of the main reasons that like I said, I grew up somewhat secular, and one of the main reasons is because as a kid I read Aristotle and I read these texts and I saw that these guys were all dualists.
right, right.
So to
So
say,
I wasn't using that as a pejorative here. It's a question. I'm asking. So from my perspective, these novel predictions and this experimental data we have with genetic memory and making all this progress, it's a very good evidence, very good logical, reasonable predictive power. So it seems to fit your definition of explanatory power very well. So this seems to have a lot of explanatory power. But you keep saying that no, you want to go with this other one. And I'm asking you, how does that have more explanatory power than all these things I listed, which are really, really good? And then
I
you
don't think
brought
they're
up,
that good. I was saying, like, you're talking about one study of implanted memories in snails related to possibly location memory, or that so even if I was going to concede to you that memory of location exists as a physical feature of the brain, that's not the point that I'm making. That is saying that when I say mind and consciousness, I specifically said the controller and thought. And so to have memories of spatial memories, I didn't even make that claim that that doesn't come from the saying that would make sense that it comes from the body, and it relates to as I said, sense perception, and saying that like I don't think that we don't have brains, the brain doesn't do anything, that God forbid, I was in anatomy, I was pre-med, like I saw dissected brains, you could see the neural circuits, and so very clearly the brain has a clear function in sense perception. There's neurons and lines running from sense cells all over the body into our brain, and some form of motor control of the body. But when we're talking about thought, and then the evidence is very weak on the materialistic side. That you could say the consensus of neuroscientists believe that they're going to come up with a model for how the brain produces consciousness or thought. You could show the neural correlates, and I mean how we got diverged with the snail model was that I said that any of these current states of evidence, like the lesion studies or the MRI data, could be equally explained that the brain receives consciousness. And the reason why you can't perform a certain function, God forbid, if there's a lesion or a part of the brain missing, is not because it was produced from that part of the brain, because that's the part of the brain that receives that function from another realm. And so I don't see any direct evidentiary line that you give from this current state of materialistic science that would make it more likely that this phenomenon is being produced from this section of the brain, to the alternative hypothesis that that section of the brain is receiving that part of consciousness from a spiritual realm.
okay, so like an analogous example would be like if we look at dark matter, there's this strange gravitational force that is far more than anything we see, but we can see other things that cause gravity, like normal matter. And so it's reasonable to think that whatever's causing that dark matter is probably just some new variation of the normal matter stuff we just don't understand yet, rather than to say it's like magic leprechauns. Maybe it's magic leprechauns, like we can't prove it's not magic leprechauns, but the better hypothesis is that, well, it's acting a lot like normal matter, and when we look at it, it does things a lot like normal matter does. And when we test normal matter, we can get it to do similar things. So it's reasonable to infer that this new dark matter stuff is kind of like the old normal matter, because it's just we're interacting with it in the same ways. Similarly, when we interact with the brain, we say, well, memory can be implanted and transmitted and just done physically, and we can insert things into the brain and add arms to the brain and do all kinds of things that wouldn't have been, we can give information to the brain, to the conscious mind, that it wouldn't have, so it couldn't have come from some external receiver source. It came from the computer we literally built into the brain.
Why couldn't have? I mean, why is it in a black box? Because we don't have a working explanation for how that part of the brain actually produced it. We just have evidence that the function was related and came from that part of it. But even according to the current state of neuroscience, materialistic, it's a black box that you're just assuming where the scientists are eventually going to come up for an explanation for how that arose from it.
Well, I mean, like, so let's say I thinking of a character or color.
We talk like Broca's area producing language. That okay, there's lesions there. There's a whole bunch of evidence.
No, I'm saying like I can make. Let's say I draw a picture,
but there is no actual model for how Broca's area produces language.
I didn't say anything about that. Broca's area. I didn't say anything about Broca's area. That's sound. I said so. Imagine if I create a pattern, a drawing or a direction, like a pattern through a maze. You've never seen it before. I can program it into a chip, plug the chip into your brain, and now you can see the pattern. You can redraw the pattern. That information wasn't received from some external receiver of consciousness out in the ether. That was received from the chip that I just plugged into your brain. So the information couldn't have come from a receiver. It must have come from that physical thing that I just plugged into your brain. So if we can transmit memories and information directly through physical means from one brain to another brain, that's evidence that that information wasn't received from an external source. It was received from the computer chip, which would give us a good reason to think that whatever is doing the memory thing there and his connection to the thoughts is connected to the physical. So it seems like even with, you mentioned there's just one paper, that's fine. We have one paper. So we now have one very good paper. And it seems like the idealist and the dualist side has nothing but a bunch of people in the past used to think this way. That seems to be, but if we weigh those two, like on a scale of evidence, one really good paper seems to completely debunk an infinite amount of past experts who used to think one way. That's kind of what Einstein did. So the fact that the evidence you presented was that lots of people in the past used to think this way doesn't seem to hold up to the modern evidence of a single paper that I presented that kind of refutes that.
Paper proved. I mean, I didn't even look at it, but just from what you're saying, I don't think it has any direct connection to what I'm saying, because the brain is obviously related to vision and sense and implant. So if you're saying that the eyes look into the world and see some sort of physical form, and that physical form is wired into the brain in the form of a memory, I'm rejecting that that's thought. And so that if the scientists could do something like that, I think it's immaterial. And saying that the fact is that scientists have been working on what you've been talking about for decades and have made very little progress. Like I don't know, it was the late 1800s with Phineas Gage and God forbid his horrific injury where that spike went through his head and then he started acting differently. To like Broca or something like that. So we've seen these correlates that like we've had ideas of I forget how many decades ago Broca it was that thinking that this part of the brain is related to language processing to actually having a model for how does that actually produce language. And as of now, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing for how that part of the brain could actually produce language. It's all Phineas Gage type stuff. When something happens bad to it, the effect isn't there, or that when someone thinks certain things, that area lightens up. There's no actual theory.
Well, again, I'm not seeing how that's evidence of your model. So the other guys haven't.
I'm saying you're the one who does. You don't have a model. You just have.
So let me phrase it. I think that memory is the same as thought. Memory is fully explained by physical stuff. Therefore, it's reasonable to think thought is explained by physical stuff. So I think they're directly connected. And from my perspective, when you're segregating,
is that a hypothesis? I mean, it's just a hypothesis you made on the spot, or are you saying that's? I mean, I know there are certain hypotheses of materials that say everything is basically memory.
Well, no. So I consider memory to be a part of the phenomenon of quality. I think having memories. I already included that into the phenomenon of quality.
Memory is basically the only phenomenon we actually observe in terms of something related to thought, like sense perception. But memory is basically the only material phenomenon that can actually be observed.
Okay, so from my perspective, memory is a kind of thought. And since memory is fully explained physically, then thoughts would inductively probably also be explained physically.
Are you
It,
trying to fit the evidence to your, because memory is the only thing that could physically be observed. So you're trying to fit the evidence to the data to your theory in saying that everything arises from memory.
no, I'm not saying everything arises from memory. I'm saying that memory is a kind of thought. It's like all roses are flowers, but not all flowers are roses. So memory is a kind of thought experience. And this kind of thought experience can be controlled physically. You can gain experience from this physical interaction. So, from my perspective, it's reasonable to infer that other flowers, more of the thought stuff, is also going to be explained physically, not necessarily yet. But this progress we've made is infinitely more than the idealists or dualists have made. And when you say that the memory part isn't a part of what you call thoughts or mind stuff, it just seems to me like you're moving the goalposts, kind of like a God of the gaps kind of a thing, where someone says, "Oh, God explains lightning," and then we explain lightning as no, it's just electromagnetic interactions in clouds from friction. Like, oh no, it wasn't. That's not God. It's God does something else because there's a new gap. It seems to me that you're doing the same thing of saying that, oh no, memory that's not a real consciousness thing. It's the other stuff that we haven't explained yet, where it's because to me it just seems like memory is clearly one of those thought thingies, and so the fact that we can explain it physically is good evidence that we are making lots of progress in this field, and that it is indicative that material stuff is the better hypothesis here because it's the only one making progress in this field.
But I mean, you agree that the scientists have been working on this for decades, and there really hasn't been that many like breakthroughs.
Sure, but I don't see why that's relevant. Like the number of years doesn't like even if it was working on it for 10 million years and nobody found anything, that still wouldn't be evidence of your model.
Well, I say as I give the example of the heart, we could make a complete mathematical uh, model, computer model of how the heart functions, of everything it does, put into differential equations, and basically an exact model of how the heart operates.
Okay.
There is no such thing for the brain that would produce thought.
Yes. Why is this? This isn't evidence of your model. So this is just we
So
don't
there's
know.
evidence that this, I say big because the simple explanation is because thought doesn't arise from the brain.
Well, that's the part. That's the
They've been
loss.
working on it for decades.
That's the connection I'm
And the
not
reason
making.
they haven't
Wait,
found
wait,
it
go
is
back,
'cause
go
it's
back.
not
That was
there.
really good. That was really good. So you said because we haven't discovered anything for hundreds of years, therefore this is evidence that thought doesn't arise from the brain. That seems to be a problem. That seems to me.
When I say it's evidence, I just said that saying that um, so if thought doesn't arise from the brain, and I mean you can't prove a spiritual realm materially because you have to use the mind.
Well,
In
right, but
order
this is where I'm getting lost. So I'm getting lost in this conclusion that you keep bringing up all these years that science has been working on it and hasn't found anything, and then you jump to this conclusion that this works as a benefit to your model. Where I don't see it as doing that. It's like we're trying to
Well, what
find.
point do you give up? What point do you give up and say, like we tried and we failed, and we can't come up with a model of how the brain produces thought and consciousness?
When we have a different model that can make novel testable predictions that
Well,
can
I'm
do it
saying that you
better.
have another model. I mean, saying that I have, not me, but I'm saying that even your own ancestors, even your own upbringing has an alternative model. You don't have to come on to my model. I'm saying the model
Oh
that
no,
you
no, I
rejected
meant
as a child. But to say that this alternative explanation that you're positing, at what point do you give up on it and say that it's not the brain? Whatever is producing this phenomenon of consciousness, either it doesn't exist or it's coming from some separate dimension, something different than the brain.
when an alternative model can make novel testable predictions that can be confirmed.
Why do you need
So
alternative models? Saying just to reject that your hypothesis has fruit, fruit and the ability to produce the answer. What does that have to do with another explanation? You just say, okay, there is no explanation. I don't think we're going to come up with an explanation, but the one we're working on isn't leading us anywhere.
well, I think it is leading us somewhere. That's why I mentioned the papers. But if you want to say like anybody can pick whatever pet
You're saying a
hypothesis.
snail, saying 50 years and you got like implanted memory in a snail.
Yes, one bit of progress is infinitely more than the 0 bit of progress that's happened on the idealist side. So I think that warrants going with the theory that's made even a little bit of progress. But you asked, at what point do I give up on a hypothesis? Well, I would say I would go with the one that I think has the most evidence until a different one comes along that has more evidence. This one has the most evidence, and if you want me to give up this theory, you would need to present a different model that and provide more evidence for it. Like, there's already lots of models. Like, I'm happy. I don't care with the number of models. I would need you to present a model that has more evidence, and the more evidence part is novel predictions. You need to make novel testable predictions which are confirmed, and then whatever model that does that is the one that I'm going to say I'm going to adopt that model over this one. So what it takes for me to
Aren't you proof
stop
to my point? Saying like,
what
didn't your own parents and your own teachers agree with me more than what you're preaching right now?
I don't know. I don't really care what the people in the past thought.
Well, I mean, you're talking like your own memory of when you were a child and your parents tried to explain to you what's the origin of this phenomenon, and your parents taught you that you have a soul and that it comes from some sort of separate realm, and you went to school and they taught you that you have a soul and it went from some sort of separate realm. It's not like, like I'm like, it's not like I'm some quack guy saying something out of the mainstream. I'm saying something that's in line with what your own parents and childhood teachers believed, right?
Sure, but that's not evidence.
But that's not evidence.
No.
It's not. I mean, it's not. It's saying it's explanatory. Like, I'm not just coming up with some wacky idea that like I pulled out of a hat. I'm saying something that's in line with what your own parents and childhood teachers said.
Sure, but that's not evidence. Like, the fact that people in the past used to believe it isn't evidence that it's true. People in the past used to believe
Well, it's
flat
some
Earth
form
was
of
true.
evidence. Saying it's conclusive. I'm saying, okay, like I'm not a Christian, but saying is the fact that there's a church on every corner some sort of proof to Christianity? So it's not conclusive proof, but certainly if Christianity is not true, then you have to have some sort of alternative explanation why there's a church on every corner. And just like if dualism or the spiritual realm is just completely wacky and made up and not true, then you have to have some sort of alternative explanation for why your own parents and childhood teachers taught you that.
Well, it seems arbitrary. Like, it's like saying, why do I have an explanation that there are 10 rocks on the floor over there? Because
You
the
talked
magic,
about consensus yourself. I mean, so you just
yes.
consensus only of what you consider experts, as opposed to general consensus. You say Christianity is just completely made up and not true, and the consensus of non-expertise is meaningless. The fact that there's a church on every corner means nothing because none of those people are experts, or the fact that your parents or childhood teachers taught you this is meaningless because they weren't experts.
Sort of. So, yeah, I think that's called a bandwagon fallacy if you just appeal to this
Well,
random
I didn't say
people.
that it was conclusive. I think it's evidence.
Well, right,
It's
that's
not.
that's
I
the
mean,
part I'm that's
it's
the
not
part I'm
conclusive evidence, but I'm saying it's some form of
that's
evidence.
the part I'm rejecting here. I don't think it's any kind of evidence. I think that's a bandwagon fallacy. I think that simply appealing to a lot of random people who don't know much about the topic isn't actually evidence. So, how would you go about showing that the fact that there's a lot of churches, or the fact that my parents told me something, why would that count as evidence at all? Because to me, it doesn't seem like it does. I don't understand your connection to why you believe that counts as any kind of evidence. You said that if you don't believe in God, you need some kind of alternative explanation. Well, that would only be true if it counted as evidence in the first place. If it doesn't count as evidence in the first place, then you don't need an explanation because it's not evidence. It's like if I said, "Oh, look, there's a cup that fell over. Is that evidence of the spaghetti monster?" No. Well, then you need an alternative explanation. Like, no, you don't. It's a cup fell over. That wouldn't be evidence of the spaghetti monster.
Well, you could have. I mean, we were talking about this last night with Jennifer on Week in Review. About the default hypothesis. So, I'm proposing a theory I called multiple truth hypothesis to help work through this. So you say there's uncertainty and there's really no reasonable explanation. That all explanations are extremely weak. If you wanted to put in like algorithmic computer terms, like a truth value function, like a chess program or a computer program that examines the equity or the value of a position, and it tries to create some sort of value of evaluation of a position that's uncertain. But that really there is no good explanation, and there's a whole bunch of explanations that have some explanatory power. Whether they're accurate or not is unclear, but they have some explanatory power. And then, like, if you're going to like Kuhn structure of scientific revolutions, that you're going to have a default hypothesis. So just say, what do you set as the default hypothesis? So you are setting, I don't know,
Materialism.
your materialism as the default hypothesis, and you say, well, but wouldn't maybe what your parents taught you, the first thing you heard, but saying what nature is there to the criteria for what the default hypothesis is, and from my standards, that I said, well, the default hypothesis is dualism, and here's this guy, he might be educated, read a bunch of studies, or quoting scientists, but his own parents disagree with him.
So how do you like establish what should be the default hypothesis? Like what is a good default hypothesis versus a bad one?
Well, I'm saying the fact that, okay, so just saying something like that. I mean, you mentioned Thor or something like that, as opposed to the church, and so you could say, from a purely logical level, that Thor makes just as much sense as Jesus Christ. And if you examine, saying the truth probability of either of those is basically zero. Um, but then you have an evidentiary um, observed phenomenon of there's not, I mean, okay, we call Thursday Thursday. I mean, there's some evidentiary, like that remnants of culture, but there's still a church on every corner. America, the West, largely has a default explanation for most phenomenon related to the church. And so, okay, so you could come up with an alternative explanation for why the majority of people believe something that's false. But there's some thing to say, like just consensus majority, that the majority of people believe this. So I'm going to call it the default hypothesis. And you talk about expertise. So I say, if you look at the experts historically, I would say that dualism and the mind coming from a separate spiritual realm is the historical default hypothesis, because the consensus of the greatest minds from all sorts of cultures and wisdom over the world were majority dualist until the last few hundred years.
Okay, so your criterion for establishing the default hypothesis is that most people believe it and experts in the past believe
Consensus
it.
of historical experts.
No, I use those as two different things. So consensus of experts would be the second thing, and that most people today, they said churches on every corner kind of a thing. So for me,
Well,
when
I'm agreeing with you somewhat, but I'm using that just the point of logic, because I agree with you on the consensus of experts and sages, but I'm looking at the whole realm of historical as opposed to presence. But I would give some criterion value to an overall consensus. And certainly, if there is a consensus and you want to set something else as the default hypothesis that is different than the consensus of the masses, then you have to explain why the masses are misperceiving the truth. How is it
yeah,
possible that this is incorrect, but the masses all believe it?
yeah. So your criterion for establishing a default hypothesis is looking at the majority of people and the experts in the past, and my criterion for establishing a
Well,
default
past the
hypothesis.
present. I mean, I'm not just saying like overall consensus of sages.
Okay, from the past. Like if we did it today, it wouldn't be. It's not anymore, so it's only of the past. But
Well, even
my
worldwide. I mean, say even say that you may not be correct. I mean, if you say
oh
what's
yeah,
if you
like if
talk
you
to
include
university professors or what we call sages, saying you can include the rabbis, the priests, the imams, the acharyas, or
sure
how we're going to include. And I say
third
even
world
globally
countries,
today, that I think the probably dualism is still probably the consensus.
sure if we include third world countries and yeah,
When
but
you have
but
to look at a pejorative or
but
something,
I
or
want
say
to I want to
population.
so those are your criterion for the default hypothesis. My criterion for the default hypothesis is the one that makes the most novel predictions. I don't care about how many people believe it. Makes no difference to me. The number of people makes 0% impact. The number of experts in the past makes 0% impact. Neither of those are good criterion in from my perspective of what qualifies as what we should consider the default hypothesis. The default hypothesis should be the one that is built upon things that have been successfully able to make novel predictions in the past. So if it's able to make novel predictions, confirmed testable predictions, scientific papers, build airplanes and stuff, that's going to be the default hypothesis. So the default hypothesis is going to be the one that's built and successfully produced the most successful predictions, and that seems to be materialism. So my
But
default
you're talking about
hypothesis,
predictions in like the scientific method,
yep.
like
Now,
measuring the acceleration of a ball, or if you're going to talk lifestyle and the associated philosophy
either
and lifestyle that goes along with the belief, and so
lifestyle.
you reject that as evidence.
Well,
You want
no,
you
like
want
I lifestyle predictions still count as predictions. So like if you can predict if I believe in a God, he'll make me $1 million and you make $1 million. That's a prediction too. I'd
Well,
say
I'm saying that
anything.
your childhood friends that still believe what you were taught as a child went on to have happier lives, more likely to be married and have children, and the people that rejected it and moved on to atheism are more likely to be, older and single and depressed or something like that, or
Well, that would be false in most non-religious countries. So that's true in a super
like a
religious
trust the
country.
plan type thing. You didn't trust the plan.
Trust
How
the
well
plan
did that work out for you?
pretty well. But the
But in terms of the basic, I mean, I'm not, harping on you and saying I'm also an older bachelor, but presumably when you were in school, like the one that that really even JF admitted that religion tends to produce more happier lifestyle for creating a family and raising children.
sure, and but only in super religious countries. Like you mentioned, you predicted
But
that.
even here in America,
Yeah, like America's a super religious country, but like in countries that are majority non-religious, people who grow up with familyhood friends who don't adopt religion are more likely to be happy because their culture and their society is mostly non-religious people. So the explanation of that phenomenon is
you're talking like
that
the UN happiness index of Northern European countries, but they're less likely to produce normal marriages and families and children, have low birth rates.
yeah, but none of that matters. Those are all options people have. Those don't like determine the better truthiness of a society. So if people
Well, the
want to have
basic function
kids,
of a man, even according to evolution, is to reproduce. And so
naturalistic.
this, if you're saying you're in line with the truth evolution, but you failed at the basic function of a man, or in countries like the Northern European, if they have happier high happiness index, that they failed at the basic function of being human, even according to evolution,
That's an
as
appeal
where
to
religious
nature.
people that believe in false beliefs are more successful at fulfilling this most basic human function.
Well, it's an appeal to nature fallacy. So evolution doesn't give purpose. Evolution is just a thing that happens. So whether or not people choose to have
We
marriage or
disagree with
kids,
J.F. Dawkins. The purpose is reproduction.
yeah, it doesn't
That if
know it.
there is a purpose, I mean, if there is a
JF
purpose, it's
JF I disagree with. JF thinks there is actually a purpose. He thinks in the
replication.
but
I
Dawkins
thought that
does
was
not.
Dawkins'
Dawkins
belief.
does not believe in a purpose. He uses it in an allegorical sense. But the vast majority of biologists agree no, evolution does not have a purpose. It's an appeal to nature fallacy, and whether or not you choose to have kids is irrelevant to your happiness or success in life or whatever criterion you want to establish there. So the fact that religious countries have more kids isn't evidence that the religious ideas are true. It's just that usually encourages them to act differently because of the tenets of the religion where they don't exist in the secular religions, secular ideologies. So that doesn't seem to count as evidence. So of all of the things you've presented are religious people reproduce more, past sages, and lots of churches on every corner. Whereas I'm saying novel testable predictions, progress in science, that seems to be a better way to establish a default hypothesis. It seems like I don't understand why you think that the criterion you presented would be a better basis to establish the default hypothesis than the novel predictions in all of science that we have. That seems
One
to
of
be
the
a much.
sages, as mentioned, Ben Watkins, the Kabbalist, just say that man is the lowest possible creature that God could have created, that on our own accord could recognize God, and the basic tenets of why God created the world, that there has to be a test, there has to be some sort of set that that there is uncertainty, that a person could reject God. So I mean, from my understanding, that say like yes, a person has somewhat like an equal tendency to be able to look at the world and say there is a God or there isn't a God, and that's because so to say the sages I follow said that's the way that God designed the world, and so it's not necessarily like an evidence that I'm going to be able to, we're not going to be able to like go out to the forest or the lab and conduct some sort of experiment. Um, you're looking at an observation for how the world operates, and so the main argument usually I give is karma, action reaction, good and bad, to which most atheists I argue with will eventually concede that they don't believe there is such a thing as karma. They don't believe that there's some sort of factual recording of good and bad, or a materialist mechanism to record whether something was good or bad, and to so to say, reward good and punish bad. And so that would be observational. That I believe the world I see, that good is rewarded and bad is punished, and that there can't be a materialist explanation for karma. That if karma is a factual phenomenon, it has to be a spiritual phenomenon.
Well, okay, but what does that have to do with like establishing the best default hypothesis? So if we're trying to establish what is the best default hypothesis, the criterion you listed of churches on every corner, experts in the past, and more babies doesn't seem to be, none of those seem to be good ways to establish a default hypothesis. Science, novel testable predictions, those seem to be very good ways to establish a default hypothesis. And if
Well,
you're
it's
just
default hypothesis because that's what the consensus of society agrees with. Even if say the consensus of certain
well, I don't care about the consensus. I'm saying that the reason this is a better default hypothesis is because it can predict the future. Yours can't. So this is very good at predicting the future.
I don't think you could predict the future. I'm saying that I mean, the science like evolution, so to say, like even with COVID-19, maybe we're better off not talking about that, but
it doesn't matter.
Whether that's the most clear example of evolution before our eyes, if evolution is true, it'd probably be COVID-19 and the variants we're facing. But in terms of that, like I don't think evolution actually makes any testable predictions. Besides maybe predicting that we're not going to beat COVID-19, is just going to keep on mutating and adapting. But even with that in the nature, in terms of like I said, that mind coming from the brain, there is actually no predictions. I mean, there are predictions, like if you remove a certain part of the brain, that that function won't work anymore.
You're going a little too far here. So my only point here is that when we're trying to establish what is a better default hypothesis, a better default hypothesis is one that can make novel predictions. It can predict the future. That is a better default hypothesis than one that just most people used to believe, or experts in the past used to believe, or one that produces the most babies. All of those criterion do not make something a better default hypothesis than one that can accurately predict the future. I mean, does that make sense? Is it just that?
Well, we're arguing that I'm saying that we have a soul and the soul is immaterial. And so what predictions does that make?
Well, you're saying
that we don't have souls, and everything that I believe is a function of the soul is in fact a function of the material.
So you're going way too far.
Our argument, right?
No, you're going way too far. So imagine we haven't discovered consciousness yet. It's not even on the table yet, and we're just trying to establish what is the best default hypothesis, a priori, kind of like what are the criterion that establish the best default hypothesis. From my position, the ability to predict the future and make novel predictions makes something a far better default hypothesis than one that most people believe, or experts in the past believe, or makes a lot of babies. None of those seem to be good ways to establish the best default hypothesis. So does just that part make sense? Forget all the consciousness stuff. Does it just make sense to say, when we're trying to establish a default hypothesis, the best default hypothesis is the one that can predict the future best?
What you're saying doesn't explain. I mean, should also explain the past and the present too, right?
Sure. I mean, I guess it would use those to try to predict the future.
I mean, evolution, so to say, isn't necessarily predicting.
This has nothing to do about evolution.
This is not about evolution. Explaining the past.
This is not about evolution. So we're just saying, remember, the predictive power is made up of these things. We want to start with a default hypothesis. I'm just going through your criterion of your epistemology just on what is the best default hypothesis. Is a better default hypothesis one that can accurately predict the future, or one that the most people and most experts in the past believe? Like, which of those is the better default hypothesis?
Well, I mean, if you say individually that, do me as an individual get to set the default hypothesis, but presumably the default hypothesis set for us, and, like we were born, there was already a default hypothesis. We might not agree with it, and that's because of the past.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm
So
asking you, like, if we get to establish the default hypothesis, like you and me are two gods and creating the universe, and we're trying to establish what is the best default hypothesis for every people to have. Is it going to be one that most people believed in the past, or is it going to be one that can accurately predict the future?
well, I recognize my humility, like I'm, like I'm a speck of nothing. That like no, I don't think that I'm going to be able to figure these things out. And so it's standing on the shoulders of giants, looking at the past. I'm not even sure that I have a single unique idea. So I mean, you think that you're going to come up with? I mean, do you have a single unique discovery idea that?
Yes.
I mean, you've published something and it's been vetted that no one else thought or wrote this before.
My objective morality. Yeah. But so it seems like most people are able to establish of these criteria, and the future prediction thinking is better. Like if we're gonna like if we're two people living on the Serengeti or whatever, and we're gonna say, I'm gonna use the model that can predict the future, which is science, to hunt, and you're gonna use the model that most people in the past used to hunt or whatever. You use a spear, I use a gun. I'm going to win. So the scientific model that can accurately predict the future and make these future discoveries seems to be better than just trusting the people of the past, right? Science, the predicting future, making discoveries, new technology stuff seems to be pretty good, far better than just trusting past people, right?
Yeah, but you're somewhat making a circular argument because what's the origin of you? What's the origin of your mind? So you're just accepting there is a me and there is my mind, and my mind figured this out, as opposed to saying like, well, how did you come into to arise, and what's the origin of the power of your mind?
Well, we haven't even gotten there yet. So this is just what is the better default
Well, I was saying
hypothesis?
that I'm not sure that whether you're in terms of physical laws, like physics or something like that, maybe that would say that, but I would say also even physics in terms of that I'm not sure if there's a greater emphasis towards predicting the future as to explaining the past, and they might go hand in hand. Uh, so I'm not sure. I mean, if you're going to put it there that you don't think the explanation of the past is nearly as important or important at all
Well,
compared to the prediction of the future.
I'm fine with part, like I think I definitely prioritize predicting the future, but my comparison here wasn't explaining the past. It was just the fact that most people in the past believed it isn't explaining the past. It's just most people in the past believed it. So the ability to predict the future is definitively better than just lots of people in the past believed this. Um, if
I'm not saying lots of the past believed it, but saying to explain the past,
to explain the
and saying
past.
that there is a phenomenon that you came into existence through your parents, and your parents believe something, and so you're saying that that means nothing. Like I'm an independent mind. So are you assuming things that aren't accurate? That that you're just an independent mind came into existence, and what your parents believe means absolutely nothing.
Um, well, I'm saying that when we're trying to establish a default hypothesis, then yeah, that doesn't mean anything as far as I can tell. The fact that we have a model that can predict the future and explain the past is far better than just one that says a lot of people in the past believed something. Like that doesn't explain the past. It doesn't
I
do
mean,
anything.
your kind of model is you're saying is independent of yourself, and it's kind of
Um,
proving my point that you're
independent.
talking abstract mind and like okay, there's a TJump, and there's TJump's mind, and there's a disconnect, a divergence between TJump's body, TJump's historical past, and TJump's mind. It was like there's a computer that you think's in your mind that was just programmed to keep on thinking about this subject until you came up with something, and what your body was doing or the origins of your body, even if that's completely divergent. And to me, that's almost like a proof of dualism that you think that the divergence between your identity in your body and what you were thinking about corresponds with your mind arising from your body.
None of that has anything to do with what I said. So I can just say I never existed. I don't care. I can say objectively, and it is an objective fact of the matter. If no humans ever existed, the better default hypothesis, the better default hypothesis is one that can predict the future. It makes I don't matter, my mind doesn't matter, you don't matter, your mind doesn't matter. It is objectively, factually the case. God himself would say this is the case. The better rational person would go with the default hypothesis that the ability to predict the future is going to be better than a default hypothesis that most people in the past believed. If your goal is to seek truth, starting with the default hypothesis of being able to make future predictions crushes starting with the default hypothesis that just most people in the past used to believe this.
We're talking about a theory of everything. You're talking about a single
any theory of any kind of any side,
one small phenomenon.
Anything, any kind of theory ever, no matter what, of all possible cases where you could ever use a theory, novel predictions is always going to be a better default hypothesis than most people.
We're not talking about something that we could go into a lab and measure. We're talking about something that's somewhat subjective, because you've admitted that currently your theory cannot be put into a lab and proven.
Yep. Even in those cases, going with the theory that makes novel predictions is a significantly better default hypothesis. So if there is a theory that made novel predictions in the past, it could predict the future in the past, that one is a better thing to trust than the fact that most
But does your theory do that?
Yes, that's what science is.
You could theorize that, like, if it costs a lot of money, but if we were having this conversation with one of those neural nets, maybe Lex Friedman or something, big enough show that he could afford to have those. But if you had big funding and the next show you had one of those things on your head and recorded the lighting up, does that actually demonstrate anything towards your hypothesis to make predictions?
So predictions here count as any prediction. Gunpowder is a prediction. Ships going the ocean is a prediction. Distance to the stars is a prediction. Every scientific discovery was a prediction.
You're not agreeing to the uncertainty. Like I was saying, that there's uncertainty of the we're just talking science of philosophy of science generally, but I was saying that they were having a set argument, and the main point of our disagreement is dualism versus materialism, and I'm saying that the phenomenon of the soul and mind arises from a separate realm, and you're saying the phenomenon
none of that matters to what I'm saying.
Of the mind arises from the
none
material.
Of that matters.
We're arguing about something different than that, and it's saying that your theory, so to say, what predictions does your theory that the mind and consciousness arise purely from the body make?
Again, so none of that matters. I'm just saying, if a theory makes any predictions about anything, forget the mind. We haven't discovered the mind yet. It's not even on the table. This model has successfully made millions of predictions. Guns, ships, go to the moon.
What theory?
Computers, science,
materialism.
Materialism.
Theory of everything you're talking about.
No, I'm not talking. No. The model of materialism, physical stuff, has made predictions. It works. Wait, stop, just listen. Just listen. Our model has made millions of successful predictions about the future. I pull this trigger, I light this thing on fire, it shoots a big piece of rock through a metal tube, it kills somebody. That's a prediction that's successful. This model of materialism has made millions and millions of successful predictions. Using this model as a better default for everything, anything we ever discover, we don't know what it is, this model is the best default. Going with one that just a lot of people in the past used to believe is a crap default. It's garbage. You should never do that. You should always go with the one that's made predictions and made a lot of them. So this model that's made any predictions about anything ever under any circumstances, no matter what, is always going to be a better default hypothesis for any unknown we ever discover ever in the future, whether we can test it or not. You mentioned, like, we can't directly experiment with consciousness. That's fine. It's an unknown. So we've come across this unknown. There's this unknown about consciousness. We don't know what it is yet. We can't experiment with it. But the better default is the one that's been able to make millions and millions of successful testable predictions in the past. That is a better default than just one that a lot of people in the past used to believe. That's a very bad default.
Well, if you're talking the scientific method, I'm saying, like, what about Newton and Leibniz, who were dualists? What about Descartes? And like, I check, like, if you're going to say, like, even the things you mentioned, that the person who invented gunpowder, I'm going to assume, was probably a dualist. And even like alchemy, or the time what people were experimenting with, or even till today, if you looked at the discoveries made today, that probably a large portion of them are done by dualists. So if you mean ascribing the scientific method of replicatable experiments that exist in the material realm, so I still not sure that you're correct, because
well, I'm not talking about what they believe. I don't care.
Phenomenon,
I don't care what they believe.
Gunpowder or something like that is a product of the material realm.
Yeah.
But what about the mind who invented it?
Doesn't matter.
If the mind who invented it was a dualist?
Doesn't matter.
So you're going to take credit for materialism, like calculus. calculus was invented by dualists.
Well, I don't care
So
what
we
the
might
duelists
use
invented.
calculus to for your theories, but do you owe something to dualism from the fact that the people who created calculus were
No,
dualists?
no. The fact that they believed something and created something is irrelevant. Like most scientists used to be Muslims before the 13th century.
Well, I'm talking the current European Enlightenment modern science,
Doesn't matter. So
the invention
nothing
of
they
modern
believed
science.
matters. Nothing they
The
believe
vast
matters.
majority of those people were
Their
dualists and
opinions do
believed that
not
their
make a
mind
difference.
didn't arise from the physical. In fact,
Their
I went
opinions
over
make
this.
no difference. So when we're saying what is the best default hypothesis, the one that has built the guns with the physical stuff and the physical predictions is the better one, regardless of whether or not the people who invented the guns happen to believe in idealism. What their personal opinions are, irrelevant to the predictions, doesn't make a difference here. What
I think
matters
it doesn't
is
because I mean, if you have to, in the theory of mathematics, where I'm going to claim to you that mathematics doesn't exist in the material realm. Mathematics is a spiritual phenomenon. A lot of the mathematicians agreed on that point. And the reality is it wasn't people who made these things. I mean, they did make it, but they used the power of mathematics, and all of the current inventions, including the computer we're using today. Like I mentioned with Jennifer a few weeks ago, we were arguing with I forget the Australia from someone from Modern Day Debate, and it was an example of imaginary numbers that we currently right now could not be doing what we're doing, talking over the internet, signal processing without imaginary numbers, even though imaginary numbers don't exist.
yeah, they do.
But
They're vectors. Imaginary numbers aren't just like, they don't mean in our imagination. They're vectors. They mean a vector. But none of that matters to my point.
phenomenon. I was saying that you need mathematics to everything you're talking about is done with the power of mathematics. So from my saying that, no, I mean, they could only do with the power of the spiritual realm, and mathematics is one of the powers of the spiritual realm.
Okay, well, that would be a separate argument. So the first thing is default hypothesis. Any
Are
theory
you claiming that these people who did these great things did it absent the power of mathematics?
absent, I don't know what that means. So a default hypothesis.
All
Anybody.
these people use the power of mathematics to accomplish these great things that you're talking about.
Okay. I don't think math is not in any way evidence of the supernatural, but again, that's not a topic I'm discussing. The topic, the only thing I'm saying here is that the fact that a lot of people believe something in the past
tool to accomplish
doesn't make a difference to what I'm saying. It's completely irrelevant to my argument. So I'm making a very specific argument.
I'm saying it is. You can't assume that they're allowed to use this tool.
I don't care whether they do or don't.
The nature of the tool
yeah,
is
fine. That doesn't matter to my argument. So all of that's fine. I'm okay with that. That's great. None of it matters to what I'm saying. So my argument is just this. The number of people who believed something in the past is a stupid criterion for a default hypothesis. The ability to predict the future, whether it's maths, I don't care, spiritual stuff, physical stuff, I don't care. Anything that can predict the future is a better default hypothesis than the fact a lot of people believed something in the past. The number of people who believe something is not a good criterion for a default hypothesis. Does that part make sense? Just that, nothing else. Nothing else about the entire debate. Just that one sentence. Does that part make sense?
Well, no, I mean, I would use some like a weighting factor and say it is a good criteria. There's other criteria that are better,
Okay.
but the number of people who believe something is one of the criteria and has some sort of weight. And if you wanted to put it into a mathematical function, you would have a whole bunch of factors and they would carry different weight. And I mean, are you rejecting that? You're saying the number of people who believe something carries absolutely zero weight?
Yes.
Or you're saying that there's other criteria that is more valuable? So I would say no. That's why that the number of people who believe something is definitely a factor that carries some amount of weight. But I would say something like evidence or consensus of experts would probably carry more weight.
Okay, how would you can you give me like an approximate number of how you would weight those? Like, I would say novel testable predictions is like 99.99999% of all weights. And then most people believe I would put it 0. Experts in the past, I'd put that at 0. So how would you establish the numbers between these? And are there any other criteria?
Well, I think you have to take it, you have to get more into the philosophy of mathematics, because how do you make novel predictions of the future? And are they in the form of mathematical equations?
Like, well, you can include math as
I'm an engineer.
Wait.
Saying that you have to, you're talking about devices that could be built and something that you could actually have an exact equation and
You
a
can
prediction
include math
and a
in the
measurement.
predictions. You can include math as a kind of prediction. So that's fine. Math is a kind of prediction. Most people
Or
believe
you're talking
something.
about exclusively mathematical predictions?
Sure, those can count. I don't care,
Are
but
you
that's
saying they
separate.
count, or are you saying
Math
exclusively?
math is different from most people in the
Is there
past
such a
believe
thing as
something.
science that doesn't include mathematical formulas?
Yes.
Or are you
History.
honestly saying yes?
Yes. History.
Saying history is a science?
Biology. Yes.
Well, I mean, they're weak science. They're saying like biology, in essence,
Most of
like
biology was done
Church of
without
Entropy
math.
to argue it.
But
They're
but
saying that these are um, derivatives of mathematics. That all hard sciences, at the end of the day, are reducible to equations. You can't have predictions without equations.
yes, you can. You can make any kind of like most predictions before math was invented were made without math. But that's again irrelevant to the point. Math is separate. Is a
I mean, until
separate
Galileo,
criterion.
I mean, to
No,
the
math is a
Enlightenment, and since
separate
Galileo, it's
criterion.
generally been accepted that
Math
science has to have corresponding
Math
mathematical.
is a separate criterion than the fact that most people believe something in the past. Those are two separate things. So the only thing I'm saying here is the fact that most people believe something is garbage. If you want to bring up math as a separate criterion, that's something separate we can talk about. What I want to know is where do you establish the fact that most people believe something? How much weight does that have compared to novel predictions in science?
I mean, Claire Claw claimed to me that your background is in marketing and sales, which is fine. Like
No, it's not.
but she could have been inaccurate. That's just what she claimed. Or maybe you had a job in marketing and sales once. I
Nope.
mean, but okay. So, but you're just saying that I'm trying to reduce what you're saying to logical, call it mathematical form, because we're arguing about the nature of truth and deep philosophical ideas, and can we reduce what you're saying to like a equation logical form?
Well, I don't need something like perfectly exact. I'm just like guesstimations. So I'm just guesstimation is fine here.
We're
How
talking about the
much?
nature of knowledge and science and predictions. So you're talking about predictions. Can you
Yeah.
reduce what you're saying to something that would basically, like, not an explanation in English, but something that could be reduced to equation logical forms that I was talking about, with a weighting factor,
Yep.
where you would have an equation that has multiple variables,
Yep.
and that would include uh, what people believe, that would have some sort of weighted value, and then you would have making predictions, and basically you're saying that it's all predictions,
Yes.
and so you're saying there's only one variable, and
Yep.
that's predictions, and it's saying, so what's the nature of these predictions? So I'm asking you if these predictions are purely mathematical in nature, that they could be reduced to numbers, that the prediction is going to be accurate to, here's an equation, here's the exact result, and then you're going to see it, and it's exactly this number, like something like material physics or engineering.
Okay, we can get into that after you answer my question. My question is how do you weight the fact that most people used to see something? Like, so there's predictions, and then there's the fact that most people used to believe something. I say predictions is 100% important, and most people is 0% important. How do you weight those?
um, I'm trying to create, I have a framework I call the multiple truth hypothesis, and like I know you play chess, and if you thought like how like a chess engine evaluates programs, and they have a weighting factor to evaluate the current position, and then the computer will rank the moves, giving a number, like if you're looking at, like, usually in centipawns, where they'll, like, one equals the value of a pawn, and they'll look at the position and give some sort of number, plus or minus a value, and uh, the weightings based on centipawns. And if you've seen some of these programs, they have weighted value type statements that look at various factors. One is just a pure material count, and various things. And so, like my multiple truth hypothesis was a hypothetical. I just saw on today, DeepMind is doing internet searches, and they also have similar truth value statements. If you had a computer try to discover the truth by searching the internet, and there's a lot of information types on the internet, and so they have different computer functions that try to evaluate the value of information that's found on the internet. If you look like, is George Washington historical figure or not? um, but hypothetically, if you set a computer algorithm to look for truth. What would that look like? And so I think you would get some sort of weighted value function where there would be a whole bunch of things that are indicator of what truth is. And they say you have a default hypothesis or varying hypothesis, and then you would have a whole bunch of factors that would all, let's say in the realm of explanatory power, which you could call predictions. And so, I mean, we've been having this disagreement now for quite tens of minutes about explaining the past versus predicting the future. And I think, depending on how you weight it, sometimes an explanation of the past could even be more important than prediction of the future. I would say, because the vast amount of evidence is the current state of what is and our knowledge about what happened in the past. So if you're talking purely science as something like you want something that predicts the future, but for something more complicated where we know there's a lot of uncertainty and the vast amount of information that exists is about the past and the present, not the future, that I would say that if you want to put purely in realms of prediction, but I'm not so sure if it'd be prediction of the future or predicting a correct explanation of the past.
Well, no, I totally agree with the past thing. Like all of my testable predictions of a default hypothesis, all of those were from the past. They were able to make successful predictions in the past.
Predicting a correct explanation of the past. That here's your theory. How correctly does that explain the past, as opposed to predicting what's going to happen in the future? I'm not even sure that predicting the future weights higher than correctly explaining the past.
Well, it definitely does, because it's ad hoc. But most people believing something is neither of those things. The fact that most people believe something isn't an explanation of the past, and it's not a prediction of the future. It's completely nothingness. So it does not fit into any of the criterion you've established of past, future, or present explanation. The fact that most people believe something doesn't do any of those things.
I mean, we're going to circle around to the nature of mind and saying, what value does truth or correct belief even have in consciousness? Like my mind, the purpose is the function of my body, not to correctly decipher the truth, or like the brain is a prediction machine. And the most important predictions are about the proper functioning of my body, not the discovering of philosophical truths.
What does that have to do with the fact that most people believe something?
Well, I'm saying, who cares what people believe? It's saying in the nature of the brain or mind, and we don't even know, you can't even establish that the mind, I mean, what is the measure of truth? Is it, so to say, objective, physical data, independent of mind, or it's going to be something mind dependent? That's why I talked about mathematics and formula. Like engineering is mind dependent. I mean, you could argue some level that even engineering or mathematics is mind dependent, but like my computer, or you could create an electronic device that measures physical data and it's mind independent. But that's why it has to be mathematical.
I have no idea how that ties into what we were talking about. So I'm just like building a model of epistemology here to say that,
is it mind independent or mind dependent?
It's mind dependent.
Epistemology is mind
it's in my mind, so it's mind dependent. So,
but it's truth. But truth is not mind dependent.
Yes, truth is independent of mind. That's correct.
Yeah, that's why I was mentioning predictions have to be mathematical, because they're mind independent. In the computer, or so to say, some objective could measure using mathematics and formula. It's mind independent.
Well, predictions.
And so to say truth is different than mathematical explanations of the material law, and saying like, is physics or science truth? Is and we're getting into epistemology.
Well, predictions are mind dependent because you have to predict something about the future which hasn't happened yet. But again, not following what I'm saying here. So I'm trying to use what you're saying to build an epistemology to compare to my epistemology to say which one's better. You said that in order to establish what mind stuff is, we have to use whichever has the most explanatory power. Explanatory power is made of three things. You listed: logic, reason, and predictive power. And when establishing those things, we have to consider the default hypothesis. And the default hypothesis is, for you, the fact that most people believe something and that experts in the past believe something and that people have lots of babies. Those are your criterion for a default hypothesis. That seems really stupid to me. The better default hypothesis seems to be one that's like science can explain the past and the future and make testable predictions, all of those things, and math. All of that is novel predictions that seems to be all infinitely better than most people believe something, or experts in the
You're
past
saying
believe something.
science is mind independent.
No, it was not a part of what I said. I said that science is better than the fact that most people used to believe something.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. We want to avoid this being circular because we're arguing about the nature of mind,
Wait,
and
I don't understand how that's
my
circular.
central tenet is that the mind is immaterial.
I don't understand how that's circular. So when I say science and novel predictions is better than the fact that a bunch of stupid people in the past believe something, that does not seem to be controversial. I don't see how that's circular. Lots of silly people in the past used to believe something. Doesn't seem to have any weight compared to science. Like if we were going to literally weigh those on the mathematical calculation scale of a chess computer's gonna be like, yeah, science, screw what all those people in the past that no one cares what they think. The computer's not going to be like, oh, lots of people in the past. Like you mentioned, DeepMind doing Google searches. Most people in the past believing something, it's going to be like, I don't even care. That's all dumb. Who cares? I'm going to go with the novel predictions. That wins. So how are you weighting these such that the fact that most people in the past believe something is better than the novel predictions? Because the computer is going to go with novel prediction. Computer's like, yeah, novel prediction. Most people don't matter.
Right, saying even don't matter at all. Saying that the
Yes.
current chess computer will beat the best player close to 100% of games. They'd be lucky to get one or two draws out of 100 games.
Yep.
And that might be coming to the point for all sorts of realms of knowledge where even in terms I saw today where they have computers trying to generate formulas or ways of understanding quantum mechanics, and it could likely be even relatively soon that
Jeopardy, Go, flying
well,
airplanes.
I'm not even talking games, but the generation of scientific theories, that the computer will more correctly generate scientific theories, and basically all of the history of human knowledge of scientific explanations will become useless compared to the computer generated explanations.
Okay,
But if we're talking, if I mean, the nature of dualism in the soul arising. So if you're talking about something mind independent, that we're arguing about the nature of mind. So if we're talking about something that's mind dependent, then we have to analyze what difference does the mind dependency make of whether the mind is material or immaterial. And so
say that
that's
again.
in terms
What
of novel
difference?
prediction. So
What
something that's mind dependent, and then would there be a difference in some observable, testable hypothesis whether this mind-dependent object, whether the mind is material or immaterial?
I'm not following. So what the difference is between mind dependent and
Some
mind independent?
phenomenon that me and you could agree upon,
Yeah.
that we agree is mind-dependent, and where there would be a different prediction created whether mind is material or immaterial. That we both
I
agree
don't
it's
need any
mind
of those.
dependent. We both agree upon the phenomenon and the prediction and the outcome. And then we could test whether a mind being immaterial or immaterial would fit closer with the facts.
Right. Yeah. If I could just show this materialism makes a prediction that idealism doesn't get it right, then yeah, idealism has been falsified. But I don't need any of that. All I need is in the past. If materialism has made predictions in the past and idealism hasn't, materialism is the better default. So I don't need to make exclusionary predictions and prove materialism true. All I need to show is that materialism is a better theory that's worked for more stuff and has done more stuff in the past. And if it's done more stuff in the past, it's the better default theory. So I don't need to show that there is a prediction that it makes that dualism doesn't. All I need to show is that it was better in the past for stuff.
Well, I mean, there's multiple predictions. I mean, you go back to Socrates, uh, the prediction that I survive death, the prediction of
Yes.
karma, and that there's a relationship between morality and good and bad and outcome of actions, that good people get rewarded and the bad people get punished.
Yeah. If either of those things had been verified, those would be great evidence for dualism.
And you
Sure.
agree that they would make different predictions, and that a dualistic model would be likely to predict that the essential I, or you, even if you don't recognize it, survives death, and that there's some sort of factual, called karma, that karma is factual. And so that mind, that a materialist, I mean, I don't know if you accept the tenet that materialism necessitates the rejection of karma.
I mean, it doesn't, but because there's lots of different versions of materialism, you could say it's just an undiscovered law of nature or something. But I would say that if we, like, yes,
That's my main argument I usually use. Like, I mean, the Buddhist, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. And, like, God forbid, if someone kills somebody and there's no witnesses, can they get away with the crime? And saying that the material realm can't record good or bad. There's no mechanism absent of mind to record good or bad. Like, okay, maybe I did something bad in the past, but there's no material evidence that I did that. It's only in my mind or other people's minds, as opposed to, it's like, no, there's a spiritual realm and it recorded that this action was done and it was bad, and there's going to be some sort of karmatic effect to the action. And so that's the main form of my argumentation that I usually give to atheism, is that you can't explain, you either have to reject karma or you have to recognize that a spiritual realm is a better explanation for the mechanisms of karma than a materialistic explanation. And I would even argue that there is no materialistic explanation for karma. That if a
because it
person
doesn't happen.
but it's saying that if a bad deed happened in the past and there's no evidence, that it's only in the mind.
Right. So karma, I think all the evidence is that karma is false. Like bad people succeed and good people die miserable deaths. But I would agree that if we died and survived death, then yes, that would be a prediction that was originally made by dualists that was confirmed. It's never been confirmed, so they have to be
But even the
confirmed
righteous getting
predictions.
rewarded and the wicked being punished. I mean, that was the sense of the argument. Like, people having big families and getting marriage and stable family life connected to belief is related to karma, in the sense that, like, there is evidence that good people get rewarded and wicked people punished. Like, I mentioned, God forbid, I almost lost a friend when I said that. My rabbi in Israel taught me that people believe in evolution because they're a bunch of perverts and they want to have forbidden sexual relationships. So they created a false theory that would allow them to moralistically condone their forbidden sexual relationships. And some sort of, generally most people believe in evolution. So you're creating some sort of hypothesis for why is it that people believe this false theory, and saying, well, people believe this false theory because they're weak and they can't uphold sexual moral standards, and therefore they designed a theory that would permit them to have what is generally considered forbidden sexual actions or
Well, so
something
but
like
that we
that.
know that's
So I mean,
false. So we know
so
that's
your
definitively
implication
false.
would be that there is no attached bad karma to forbidden sexual action, like,
No, that has nothing to do with what
pornography
I said.
or
So
adultery
so
or
we know
something
karma
like
is
that. That
false. We know
if a
karma is
person,
false. Like none of what you
well, I
said is
think it's
true.
true. You're
So
saying,
so
like, okay, if a
go back,
person
go back,
cheats on
go
their
back,
wife
go back. So
and there's no evidence, can they get away with it? So no, karma is
sure,
real. You can't get away with it. But as long as there's no evidence,
people get away with it
like,
all the
I'm
time. I
not
don't
going to
I
tell.
don't know
She's
what
not
you're
going to tell.
saying. Like people get away with it all the time. Bad people commit murder and rape
That's
all
your
over the world.
hypothesis that they get away. That's a testable hypothesis.
Yes.
You're saying bad people because like, God forbid, you've done these things and gotten away with it, or
I've
you're
done
saying
lots
that,
of things and gotten away with it, but
well, have you?
sure. I mean, yes. Um,
I mean,
but I'm
you're
not
saying that,
seeing the problem here. Like, yes, lots of people steal and murder and rape and get away with it. That's what lots of the court cases are for. And they go in it like, what was this? Oh, a big football player. I started with an O. Who stabbed his ex-wife, girlfriend.
well, I mean, human court. I'm here in Metro Detroit. God forbid, we got a lot of murders, like 400 murders a year, and less than 25% of those get solved. God forbid, rape is horrible. Less than like 10%
Yeah.
of rape accusations get punished. But from a larger, not talking the human court, but from a karmatic standpoint, did people get away with it? And it's like, no, they didn't get away with it. They had bad karma, and what comes around goes around. And you see that, no, there was some sort of, even though the legal system failed, even though there wasn't enough evidence to try them in the court of man, that there is a separate spiritual realm that recorded the bad action, and those people were
O.J.
held.
Simpson, yeah.
I mean, you agree that that's, uh, I would say, the
Where
essential.
is the evidence of
Uh,
that? Because to me, all the evidence says that, yeah, Donald Trump is a terrible person, but he became president of the most powerful person in the world, a billionaire, the supermodel wife. Yeah, I don't see this karma thing working. Like, what's his
well,
name?
Donald Trump's a
Epstein.
complex person who did a lot of good deeds and a lot of bad deeds, and was saying, well, say he was punished in sense like, okay, like he didn't get away with his sexual infidelities. It came back to bite him, and he didn't. He doesn't have a happy family life, and but to say, was he a good person? Okay, but maybe he supported Israel, or he gave a lot of charity. He helped a lot of things out. To how you're going to balance what is karma and what is a balance of karma. But
Yeah, so it seems like your balance of karma is complete, really ridiculous. Like people who do heinous, immoral crimes and murder lots of people go free and live happy lives and get families and all kinds of thorough things that all the people they killed didn't. I'm not seeing this karma thing as being quite legitimate unless, oh, they got a paper cut, therefore their karma is completely balanced, and even though they've murdered like
I mean, we
10,000
have to
people.
some sort of standard for seeing that. So okay, like most criminals. Uh, I mentioned Luke Ford, who set me up streaming and who was a porn reporter, and like, God forbid, most people involved in pornography like didn't go on to have long, happy lives. Saying that, like I was in religious school, and I know a lot of people that in their old age have together families that didn't divorce, children that love them, grandchildren that come to see them. And I mean, as the Talmud says, in the old age, the people are going to sit around, and the people who didn't sin are going to say, "Praiseworthy is the person that never sinned."
That seems like cherry
And so
picking. It seems like you're cherry picking an example of people who usually they probably went into porn because they didn't have much money and had to anyway. But it doesn't seem
I'm
to
just speaking to Luke
discount.
Ford, who's an expert on it, but he's
It
saying
doesn't
that
seem to be
I
doesn't
don't
seem to
think
be
you're going
relevant.
to.
It
I don't
doesn't seem
think
to be
you're going to
relevant.
give too many
Like
examples.
you're not saying like
If you're talking
mass
drug dealing,
murderers, mass
violence,
murderers, mass rapists, genocides, dictators live perfectly wonderful lives in mansions with lots of people who they own and can do whatever they
mass
want
murderer
with.
lived a perfectly wonderful life in mansions without any
Yes,
repercussion. I mean, even like God
the
forbid,
dictators in Africa, this
Dr.
is
Mengele, who
extremely
never
common.
got caught, lived like under
Genghis
anonymity.
Khan, Attila the Hun. There are
Those are
many,
still. I
many
mean, but he
dictators
had a
who,
horrible death of sickness. He didn't live that long.
after 40 years of raping and pillaging, he died over sickness. Oh, everything's even now,
I mean, he
perfectly
didn't. I mean,
normal.
he only lived 40 years. I'm saying like he didn't live into his long life. And I mean, you think like even
Yes, and clearly
God
that
forbid, someone
balances
like
all of the
Dr.
mass
Mengele,
murder.
who lived out into his long life, he lived most of that in hiding. He didn't live in a mansion. He lived under assumed identities in hiding.
Yeah, clearly that makes up for all of the mass murder and all of the dictators in Africa. Yeah, yeah,
Well,
no.
it's even it out, but he's saying like no. I mean, what mass murderer died in old age, surrounded by their family and grandchildren in a
You can
loving
actually
environment?
Google it. There's a list of them in the African dictators who all did that. Yes. This is a really
Maybe. I
common
mean,
thing, like most of them did.
I don't. I mean, I don't think it's that common. I'm saying like I think it's
It's
pretty
extremely
common.
common.
I could go to any synagogue, church, mosque, Hindu temple, and I'm going to see relatively righteous people who have their kids and grandkids and family coming together in their old age. And like, no, I don't think that there's too many dictators like that. There might be a handful of exceptions, but like, no, most dictators die, and most of them die like horrible death. Is just saying like there's not like drug dealing. There's not that many old successful drug dealers. It's a short term career that doesn't succeed for long term prosperity. Certainly, being a dictator or a criminal, and okay, I'm already middle aged, and even like your high school bully or your high school uh, drug dealer or something like like I was young and this guy was getting all the girls, and it looked like he was the center of all the parties. What happened to them now? And like the revenge of the nerds, and saying like, no, this guy went to school, he has a good profession, he eventually found a wife and has a family that loves him. He'll probably make it into old age and have his kids and grandchildren around him. And that, no, I don't think most of the people who chose negative lives are going to have a loving family and respect in their old age.
I mean, yeah, that's just definitively wrong. Like most human beings are normal human beings,
Or is your
both good and
perception?
bad.
So is it, if we could objectively
No, like
measure it,
we can't.
so I
We
mean, you're
can't.
saying
If karma
you're
was real,
based on your uh, experience, that you're saying you've done a study of this, or just
yes,
your.
there's been many studies on karma and it's been definitively proven false. And the easiest ways to do this is to use the very extreme examples of the dictators who lived perfectly happy lives and had like 1,000 wives, like I forget the emperor of China,
How many of those are, like 10 of those in history?
which defeats your whole argument. If
No, I mean,
karma was
you're trying
real,
to prove the rule from an exception. I'm saying, okay, the fact that Dr. Mengele lived out his whole natural life, might be an exception to the rule. But let's say, like, no, there's only a handful of probably people you could even name of dictators that even made it to old age, let alone maintained some sort of status that didn't survive in hiding.
yeah, but that's true of
And
everyone. Most people don't make it to old age. Most people die horrible deaths and don't have terrible lives. Like most humans, most every living being on the planet dies horrible lives. So those people you're listing actually had some of the best lives possible on the planet because most people died from starvation and thirst and childbirth and diseases that they could do nothing about and dysentery and appendicitis. Yeah, most poor people die horrible deaths. Most poor, kind people who live their lives in servitude to God die worse deaths than all of those dictators that you just mentioned. They have better
maybe if
lives.
you're giving a worldwide comparison, you're saying like evidentiary, okay, like the people I go to synagogue with, that probably 25% of them make it at least into their 60s and to see their grandkids, and even more than that. I mean, if you're going to give a whole worldwide comparison, even in India, people, followers of Hinduism that trusted the plan, got married, stayed with their wife, worked an honest job, that the majority of those people made it into old age and had a family that loved them, like dependent on
Like,
the life expectancy in different areas. And that people who are successfully dictators, that you would only be able to give a handful of examples historically of people that were
no, you give
successfully.
thousands of them, but
You could
so
give
the
thousands
vast
of examples
majority,
of historic
yes,
dictators that went
yes,
on to have happy lives and
yep.
long age.
Yep. So if you compare literally every human being who lived about 5,000 years ago and who had happy lives, were mostly dictators, and everyone else was poor and
How
died.
many dictators were there?
Lots of them, like, they ruled most of societies. Little
Well, I was saying,
kings,
like,
little
in any
knights.
given time period, you say, okay, there was one Roman Empire. I mean, there's only like tens of Roman empires in all of history.
Well, each you could consider each of the different
Like,
like
even if you add up and
journal.
say,
No, 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 no,
like,
no.
if you
Like
did study of
there
the
are
Roman
lots and lots of
empires,
people in the Roman
most of those
Empire.
people
Wait,
had
wait, wait,
pretty
wait. Go
negative
back, go
ends.
back. Roman Empire. Each like dictate who had a little area of land and could rape any of the women they wanted in that land and collect taxes in that
What
land.
Roman Empire had like a happy end? Like, just off of memory,
No,
can
no,
you
no.
name one
Stop interrupting.
that had
Stop
a
interrupting.
happy
I'm
end?
already addressing your point and you're interrupting to avoid it. So every single one of those leaders, the governors who owned the land and could rape the women and do whatever they wanted to, they had better lives than all of the people under them who did everything right and were kind. So yes, every single one of those, the happiest people were the dictators, evils, rapists, murderers who took what they wanted, and the people underneath them who lived perfectly happy lives and served God were miserable and died younger and had worse lives. So yes, if we're comparing all of those people who are evil, evil people, they had better lives than all of the people around them who are very good people. Karma is bullshit.
Okay, well, I mean, that's my main argument that I give. And if you want to continue on the argument or try to form some sort of metric to measure it, because I think that your example. I mean, even just the words coming out of your mouth, to the people watching, that you're claiming that like rapists and murderers have better lives than good, decent people who tried to do the righteous thing.
Yeah.
I mean, God forbid that. I mean, that's the main argument that I give. So it's like, whose side do you want to be on? I mean, I haven't been on my side, but you're saying you want to follow the guy who said rapists and murderers have better lives.
Yeah, they did. That's kind of the point. That's why they do it. That's why most of history is run by the dictators and the people who were slaves were slaves. It's
So
in
we
the
say it's
name.
factual. So it's like, okay, you're like, you want to be like Jeff or something. You're saying like doooovid, like just face the facts. Like, like
Yes.
you're wrong. And saying
Yes.
that, not saying but no, my experience says that karma is factual. People get punished for their bad deeds and rewarded for their good deeds. And like, if you wanted to do a historic survey, I would like to see you produce some sort of paper of a study of like rapists that went on to have successful lives. And like, I seriously doubt it.
Karma is obviously fake. most times the good guy loses. Frank, super thanks for the super chat. Thanks Toas for the super chat. Yes, so the whole point of slaves weren't bad people. They were perfectly fine people. Like you're just living in their huts with average lives, and they were sold by the people who owned them, the kings. The like all of African slavery was just the kings who captured other tribes people who were living normal lives, sold them to slavery. Kings got rich, lived happy lives, died with their families, and all the slaves went to be slaves and were killed and beaten. And yeah, I think that's face the facts, doooovid. I think you kind of got destroyed on that one.
No, I mean, you didn't give any evidence. You just cited
The entire history of slavery in America.
Of history.
Yes, the entire.
Like, I mean, God forbid that's your experience in the world.
My experience. Anecdotal fallacies aren't evidence.
No wonder you're an atheist. Like, God forbid, if that. I mean, it's like God forbid, like Jews generally make up the highest proportion of atheists in America, and generally it's the Holocaust. God forbid that the general. Although there's studies that discount it, like you. I watched your video. But I mean, generally, the majority of the reason why people are atheist is because of suffering, and even a personal feel that people are like, I suffered and I cried to God and God didn't answer my prayer, therefore there is no God. Which I watched your video. It's even linked on your the main video on your page, where you said you became an atheist largely because you felt that you prayed and it wasn't answered. But you say if you had a negative experience with the world and you became an atheist because you see the world as such a negative place and therefore you're an atheist, and it's okay, thank God my life has been pretty good, from what I've seen. Like I think that God is fair and just, and therefore I'm a believer, and you want to take it to a scientific level and objectively. So you say, well, if I were you, maybe I'd be an atheist too. God forbid, like I don't want to be you because maybe you had a pretty bad life. But I think no, even if I were you, I probably wouldn't want to be an atheist. Or you're saying the opposite, because a second ago you seem to be saying the opposite. You're saying that like you do think you have a pretty good life, and that it's not because you suffered that you're an atheist. And then you think that, or you're saying that God forbid, you think that your reality, you can get away with raping and killing people, and that karma is not factual, and that's your understanding of society, that you think most murderers and rapists are like they're around us and we're looking around, and the people you see are people who raped and killed people and got away with it because there is no God, there is no karma.
Yeah, I just think that's what all scientific and historical evidence indicates, and to think otherwise is just a fairy tale that you tell yourself.
That's what you're saying. You see with your own eyes, like
that's what the scientific consensus is.
Well,
that's what the scientific consensus is.
The wrong places.
That's what all of the scientific historical consensuses of every single academic field who's not a nutcase. All of the facts, all historical facts point to this. This is just an indiscernible thing. Karma has been debunked. Yeah, evil people succeed and have happier lives than the good people who they control. Yeah, it's just a fact. Like all of the facts, all of the science shows this.
I mean, there's originally why I brought up the reproduction and happy marriages. That, I mean, even absent happy is a subjective word, but if you're just saying successful building up a family life and children, that I would say the evidence is actually in favor of
Genghis Khan, who has his DNA who's spread across like 70% of the population because he raped thousands of women. That would be why. There you go. So again, just it makes no sense what you're saying.
Well, it's like karma is complicated.
Karma works in mysterious ways.
I'm saying of Donald Trump, karma is a sum total game of good and bad. So you say a person gets rewarded for the good and punished for the bad. It's like Donald Trump has had a lot of reward, has had a lot of punishment, and if you look at his own personal life in terms of like his failed marriages or family life, and you could say, okay, sexual improprieties came back to haunt him, and he didn't get away with those. And then you look, okay, maybe
looks like he got away with them to me. Like he still has a happy life. He got away with it.
What a happy life! I'm saying he has failed marriages. He has kids from somewhat like a broken family. He lives half the time away from his wife. He doesn't have a normal, happy family life.
So he doesn't live the way you think he should.
Is his sexual improprieties?
No, that's he doesn't live the way you think he should. But he's happy in his life. A lot happier than many people who do live the way you think they should. There are a lot of religious
Well,
people who have.
successful and happy aren't necessarily the same thing. It's okay, made a bunch of money, or saying, and if you're looking at karma as a science, that there's a sum total of good and bad, and that good gets rewarded, bad gets punished. And saying, so is Genghis Khan even an exception to the rule, or is Genghis Khan a rule to Donald Trump a rule towards karma, that he did a lot of good, he got rewarded for it, he did a lot of bad, he got punished for it, and saying the blatant bad that he did, or even basic character type things that you're saying, like that man has bad character, and you could see the result of his human interaction of his bad character. Had he not had that bad character, he would have had better human interaction. But in terms of building up a good business, or various things, maybe he did the right thing. He worked hard. He got up early. He worked 18-hour days.
He manipulated people, stole people's money, borrowed people without paying it back, took advantage of people, and made billions of dollars off of it.
They had a good work ethic, and saying that.
No, he stole money. He stole money.
Well, if you look at any of the examples, I mean, you think Donald Trump is the classic example of Donald Trump to you is a textbook example of why it can't be true that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished.
Yes, and Stalin and all the dictators and murderers and rapists that exist everywhere. Yes.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump made into old age. He's still widely one of the respected. So, I mean, obviously, Genghis Khan, Stalin, a lot of these people died or ended up.
No,
dying
all those people still made it to old age.
Death.
All those people still made it to old age, given their time period.
But, I mean, they were eventually like murder came back, and they died of murder.
Nope, Stalin was not murdered. Most of them were not murdered. Most of the dictators were not murdered. They just retired. Lots of the African ones are just retired. Nope, that wasn't murder. And even if it was murder, they still lived longer lives than all of their subjects who were murdered by them.
I mean, of the people who committed murder, that they would die for murder, which would be karmatically, might make sense to say that the people who commit murder are likely to die of murder
30 years later. Oh no.
Well, I mean, that's karma. It's still karma that the person murdered and they died of murder.
Yeah, that's a pretty terribly not good system.
Well, I mean, we're talking factual, so I'd say, okay, this is
the world
we live in.
What you're saying isn't factual.
Explanation for the phenomenon. We both recognize, like agreed upon phenomenon.
No, there's no phenomenon there. I presented you numerous historical examples where it's just bullshit. Like I've literally proven your example false.
I'm not disagreeing on the phenomenon. We're saying, are these? I mean, you're giving single examples that you think are an exception to the rule. So I was saying that generally, without looking into single examples that you appear to be exceptions of the righteous being rewarded and the wicked
most
being punished,
people who murder aren't murdered.
As a general rule, that the righteous get rewarded and the wicked get punished, and as opposed to bringing up single exceptions, and we could look at the single exceptions, but you're saying as a general rule, it's not even that you don't even think
it's false.
The average good person gets rewarded or the low tier criminal gets punished.
Yeah, it's false. Like most murderers don't get murdered.
I mean, have you seen a study on that?
Yeah, you can just read the numbers, like just count the number of murders and how many are actually murdered henceforth. Literally, if every murderer was murdered, then it would take one person to murder them, and the number of murders would have to increase proportionally to the number of people who were murdered. And most of them weren't murderers when they were murdered. So statistically, it's just not possible for that to be the case. We just look at the murders in America. Do the people who commit murders get murdered? No. Most of them...
Well, and because we have an artificial system that takes them out of sight.
20% of murders are solved and people sent to prison. Like, most murderers don't get sent to prison.
Well, I'm saying one, like, of people in prison who get murdered in prison, and then saying the people who commit murders and don't get caught by the system, eventually street justice will deliver them murder.
No, if that was the case, then we'd see significantly more murder. So that's not the case.
Well, I'm saying that, I mean, God forbid, I don't know what area you're in. I mean, because, God forbid there's a lot of murders in my area. And I said most of the people don't get caught. And a lot of the people are relatively innocent, most of the victims of murder. But most murder is actually escalation of arguments, and a lot of times that is people involved in gangs, and in saying they might not have caught to make a false assumption that gang violence is a relation that these people lived violently and died violently. I mean, there's victims, innocent victims of gang violence, but saying the majority of victims of violence is internally gang violence, people involved in gangs, people who use violence against others, and eventually that meet the same violence that they use towards others.
Nope, because that only applies to the young ones who are used as soldiers and the ones who are the generals and taking advantage of all the rewards. They live fantastic lives.
I mean, the generals you didn't reach management in gangs without some point being violent yourself.
Yes.
And saying like that. I mean, you could be like a financial position or something, but say like no. I mean, well, it's like, I mean, this you would have to do some sort of study, but saying this, I mean, you accept that this is a worldview that would have different understandings of predicted outcomes. That you're predicting that there's no correlation between good deeds and reward and bad deeds and punishment, as where this dualistic system would predict that there'd be some sort of correlation between good deeds and reward and bad deeds and punishment.
Thank you, D6, for the super chat. Karma works, except the times it does not. Correct.
No, and we understand it. We're saying if karma is like science, I mean, as a believer, karma is an absolute rule. You have concepts like reincarnation or punishment after death or something like that. But if you're a believer, like, I mean, as I said, a lot of atheists, that's the reason they're atheists, because they observe that karma doesn't work and their belief system didn't match what they observed, mainly that there should be karma, and they observed that it doesn't appear that there's karma.
Yes.
I mean, at the same time that the religious text, God is slow to anger, gives people long periods of time to repent. The punishment for sin isn't instantaneous. It could be decades, could be lifetimes.
So it's unfalsifiable. You have no evidence.
Well, I'm saying if you're going to look at reincarnation or post-death punishment and to be unfalsifiable, but I mean, generally the sages say in this lifetime and over, okay, now I'm already a middle-aged man, that over decades, that I say, yes, the people who trusted the plan generally have better results than the people who broke the rules, as a vast observable rule as a middle-aged person.
Seems like,
and sometimes it took a decade that you could have been a young
Texas
man.
sharpshooter. It's a Texas sharpshooter. So the fact that most people live successful lives by following the rules is because the rules were put in place in order to help people live successful lives. It's not karma. It's just most of those rules are designed in order to help people function in society. That's why people do mostly function in society. But we know karma is false because there are people who can easily break the rules significantly and have no consequences for it. And that happens all the time.
I'm rejecting that. I mean, you're postulating that there's people who could easily break the rules and do it all the time.
Yes. So if anyone,
I'm just saying, like, you want to dox yourself and saying, like, God forbid, you're like, trust me, like, I'm a known criminal, like I'm the mob, like doooovid, like, I don't mean to tell you, but like, I'm the mob and I do all these bad things and I just can't tell you. But I mean, is that what you're saying?
I know lots of people like that, actually. Yes.
Okay. I mean, God forbid, say maybe that's why you became an atheist, saying because that matches your observed experience.
Not why I became an atheist, but point is that that's why karma is false.
And I mean, it's like I live in Brooklyn. It's like like the Hasidic neighborhood's right next to the Italian neighborhood. Like there's a lot of mob, but even in the mob, it's usually the believers, the people who follow the rules, that have the generic happy lives. And like there's a lot of funerals, and at funerals there's usually explanations. Like I remember I was first in synagogue, and this guy, like a bomb went off in his car, and it went outside. Like it's like what happened? Oh, he was connected with the bomb. It's like the explanation. I mean, there's a lot of bad things that are unexplainable, but as a general rule, that I think that's the strongest explanation of how you live your life. So if you're fitting the data that you've been an atheist for a while, so you're trying to fit the data to your philosophy, as opposed to saying like, no, I've been a believer for my whole adult life, and I've seen some messed up things. I say people do some bad things and appear to get away with it. But even just over 2 decades of observation, that I think generally the righteous get rewarded and the wicked get punished. Um, and you're saying the opposite, and saying it's not necessarily. I mean, you're saying that I'm incorrectly observing the data that I observed, or I'm biased, or possibly you admit you might be biased.
I think you're using an anecdotal fallacy and dismissing the actual data that's been accumulated by all of the different reputable sources throughout all history and governments and everything else. I mean, then you're taking
You got to
in
go
the
back to your parents and your teachers. I mean, you're also antidotal,
what
and then you say like your
and
own antidote that is saying that you went against. It's okay. Your parents. You're saying like they. I mean, I don't mean to be personal. Like accuse your parents, could be my parents, anybody's parents.
I like never
But
spoke to my parents, so I don't know. I'm not using anecdotes. I'm using the actual papers and
But I'm saying
research on
your
crime.
average person whose parents taught them to be a good person, and that they're that it's a pretty common thing for parents to say be a good person. What goes around comes around. That teach their kids that there's some sort of karma. Or you're saying like no, I mean you knew a lot of parents taught their kids to cheat. Parents said like like oh like these people are dumb and they're suckers, and when they're all doing that, I'm going to teach you like you're my kid and you know that you could cheat and get away with it.
No, what parents teach their kids is irrelevant to karma. It's how what people actually do. The fact that most
We
parents
have to
teach their kids
explain the
one thing,
past. You're
that
saying if it's
doesn't
so
explain the
blatantly
past.
false, why are people teaching something? Why is the predominant view something false? If you could murder and rape and get away with it, why do people teach teach the law and to be good citizens?
Because that's what helps societies grow. So on an individual basis, selfishness works, but on a collective basis, giving people a moral framework causes the society itself to grow faster, which is why we have police rather than the selfish societies, and why there's that evolutionary thing that was talked about in Dawkins, one of the Dawkins documentaries, where it showed that the selfish one's game theory, the selfish one can succeed more for himself, but collectively the society does better when it's working under the same motives. So yes, the selfish ones do succeed. They are successful. They're just not as successful as the collective societies working together. So game
And
theory
so this
proves
would
you're
be
wrong.
harder to model as opposed to like a brain going to a lab and like putting some sort of one of us in an MRI scan and showing us pictures or telling us to think things, even to some crime statistics or observations, longitudinal studies of masses amounts of people over long terms of their life, that it comes down to a worldview that has predictive power. And it's hard. I mean, you're saying you are going to go as far to complain as explain or predict that you could predict that karma does there is no such thing as karma and test it, or you're saying you wouldn't be trying to prove a negative, that I'm proposing karma that you can't disprove that karma exists, or you could prove like say like here's a test, God forbid you're trying to recruit somebody for the mob, and your first test is you're going to go commit this crime, and you're going to see that you're going to get away with it, and that's your induction, and that's your experimental test. Like if what I'm saying is true, you could go out and do these horrible things and get away with it.
I would say that if karma was true, people who lived moral lives would cumulatively live happier, longer lives than people who did immoral things. And I would say that's false.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So how do you test your hypothesis? You test it by like inducting people to the mob and trying to get them to go out and do horrible things, and then get away with it.
I mean, you could do some immoral tests like that, but we don't have to. We can just look in the past and statistically calculate, yeah, it's false. Like we can say that, yes, people who lived moral lives and never did anything wrong were mostly the slaves because they couldn't have done anything wrong. And the people who did lots of things wrong were the people who owned the slaves, did lots of immoral things, but they lived lots longer, better, happier lives because they had access to more doctors, better living situations, more food, more water, more people that they could own as slaves to do all of their work for them. Like that's just the majority of human history is just that.
I had hypothesized that, I mean, God forbid, actually, Jeffrey Epstein was actually conducting scientific experiments, or maybe not him, but like not just a lone pervert, but he had a lot of these MIT scientists, and I mean, it's, it uncovers some sort of conspiracy, but they were actually conducting scientific experiments and something like that. If you say like you can't get away with that, it's like, well, watch me, here I'm doing, I'm getting away with it, And then the person said, well, oh, like, I didn't think he could get away with it, but he did it right in front of me and got away with it. And then, eventually inducting people to do these bad things and get away with it. And even if that were the case, that, there's okay, like, no, there's karma. You can't get away with that. But karma doesn't mean the hands of man in the court. So, like, I lived in New York, and most fights, the police never come. Like, I'm in Detroit, like, the police take like 20 minutes. When I lived in New York, like, there was bars around the corner, look out the windows, and there would be fights outside, basically every night, and people would be there the first time waiting for the cops to come. It's like, the cops aren't coming. Like in New York, it takes like 20 minutes for the cops to come. Rarely that's the way it works. So karma is a long range type phenomenon, that even if you could demonstrate that, like, saying like, watch me, I'm going to do this right in front of your eyes, this horrible thing, I'm going to get away with it, that karmatically you say that, like, no, there's a spiritual imprint, and there's like an accounting system. You're like, Santa Claus, he's making a list and he's checking it twice, and that there is a factual accounting, and this bad thing is recorded, and it will have a reaction at some point in the future. And that's relatively, it's a scientific hypothesis, whether it could be tested or proven. But I mean, karma is, I mean, you would agree that it's somewhat of a scientific hypothesis.
Yeah, I think it's been falsified. What would change your mind if, like, what would it take to change your mind to show you that karma was false?
Well, it's because related to a belief system. So I mean, if God forbid you do, someone demonstrated that they did bad things and got away with it, that would be some sort of evidence. But saying like long term, and saying like, okay, maybe reincarnation, maybe post death punishment, that a lot of people who experience negative things still believe in karma. I went to school of founded by majority Holocaust survivors, and some people prided themselves on never giving up their belief despite what they witnessed, and as like a test to their beliefs. I mean, obviously you could still have some sort of explanation, even if it goes against what you see with your eyes. And there's biblical texts that even say that, don't follow your heart, don't follow your eyes. If what your eyes see goes against what the scriptures say, you're better off not believing what your eyes see. But I'm talking about the vast, what I would say is the vast majority of observable evidence, where you don't have to come on to these deeper spiritual things.
Right. So that's why I said this seems unfalsifiable. So I said, what is the criterion that would?
My phone.
Oh, sure. Can you still hear me? Just wait.
I'm sorry, just had to check. Just had to check my phone message there. Oops,
All right.
off my.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Yeah. So my question is what would cause you to change your belief in karma? What would falsify it? Because it seems like it's unfalsifiable. You're just going to say, oh, well, even if he lived a horrible life and did lots of evil things and got away with it, oh, maybe he didn't get away with it in the next life, but there's no way to verify that. So what is a way to falsify your position in karma?
Well, as someone with religious conviction, I would say that that there's nothing. That, like, even if all of the evidence in front of my eyes, like, saying, that's why I said I went to schools in Jerusalem, New York, founded by Holocaust survivors, that they say like nothing. There is no evidence that you would provide that would stop me from acting out on my beliefs, and it would be based on something that's unfalsifiable, like my belief, what's going to happen in the next life. So I would hope, as a religious person, that there's nothing that would change my conviction. But in terms of a scientific, conception, and saying like a lot of times, like, it was World War II, it was the complete upheaval of society, in what people with a normal conception of what they understood to be what meant to live a good life and the reward expected, and that not working out. So I would make it twofold. That say, I would agree with you that I would transcend logic, and I would hope that I would accept my suffering, even to, God forbid, death and torture, and I would not, so to say, curse my maker, that it wouldn't matter what happened to me. I would not curse my maker. I would not reject my belief system, although I do think my belief system is logical and corresponds with the majority of the observable evidence.
All right. So would anything convince you to lose your faith? Is there anything you could see that would make you lose faith?
Well, the Talmud gives the example of the rabbis, or people. If I was tortured to death, like, I don't think I would curse God, but it's possible if I was tortured to death, I would curse God. I don't want to be tortured to death. I don't want to be put into that test. But if you're going to take it to that level and say that like, for whatever reason, if I was being tortured to death and the person just said curse God and I'll put you out of your misery, that I would not curse my maker.
Well, I
That's
meant
like the
more
book
like
of that's
evidential.
like the book of Job, and saying like, no, there's absolutely nothing that could transpire that would cause me to curse my maker. I assume you've read the book of Job, or at least familiar with that.
I mean, like rather than just being tortured to death. I mean, like, is there any evidence that you could see that would convince you that it wasn't true?
Um, well, some of the observable. So I'm saying that I would, at least as I'm stating now in my current state of, so to say, consciousness, that no, even if the observable evidence changed to corresponding, that my eyes saw that this belief system was untenable. So in my current state of consciousness, I would say no, that wouldn't change my course of action. I would go against the evidence, um, largely in line with the sages. So say, why am I trying to be in line with the sages? And why is that fundamental to my belief system? And even to make predictions about how we would act if circumstances were completely changed, like if we were uptaken in like in a Chinese dominated society or something, where the ruling class spoke a different language and subjugated us to second hand work, and we couldn't even speak the same language as our masters to change our situation, and that went on for decades and decades, or something like that. I can see that logically you could create a scenario where it would become logical that I should reject my system, but so to say that I want to be a righteous person, if it's an unrighteous world and everyone around me is acting unrighteously, that I would like to be like Noah, or something. Like, I would like to be the independent righteous person of my generation, even though no one else is righteous.
Okay, then. Let's see. Yeah, you mentioned good and bad morality. Like, I'm an atheist. I think there is an objective morality. Why would that be evidence of a god?
What do you say? Objective morality as a, you do believe there's objective morality
Hmm.
on what axiom? It's saying that, I argue it even to put that, how do you even derive that life is good, even like death, that it's better to be alive than dead, under atheism. He was, okay, you are alive, you might have some sort of instinct that wants you to maintain being alive, but to objectively say that it's better to be alive, it's better to be in a state of pleasure than pain, or something like that, how do you even derive that?
Well, you can do it from a law of nature, a platonic object, an abstract ideal. You don't need a god for that. So why would you need a god for any of that?
Well, I'm saying it's not objective, it's just a preference, like JF is saying that morality is a preference.
Right.
It's
I'm
not
saying it
objective.
can be objective as a law of nature, undiscovered law of nature. It can be objective as a platonic object. It can be objective as an abstract ideal, a priori. What's it? Forget what the. I think it's an a priori something or something. Yeah, you can have all those as objective without a god. You don't need a god for any of the goodness to be objective.
Well, you could say, do you need something to survive death and to be permanent, to be objective? And then you say, even if at our death, that's the end, there is no continuation to what it meant to be me, or you, or anything, that death is a finality, that you could still have some sort of objectiveness, and then even come down to a zero sum nature, that if there's that so to say, like the tragedy of the commons, that it pays to cheat, or utilitarianism, that but I generally I argue that it's very difficult to near impossible to devise a moral system um, based on uh, atheism, without that this use, okay, that there's some form of life instinct, and let's say evolution is the cause, and the desire to replicate, or something like that. Therefore, I desire to live, I desire pleasure, but that doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. And you're saying like karma is good or bad, and you say karma is not factual. That good and bad is not factual. So I'm not sure if you're trying to derive some sort of utilitarianism, like code of action, or you're trying to derive that what you said. Karma means that there's rules that good is rewarded and bad is punished. So you're saying you could derive good and bad, even though you can't derive that you'll be rewarded for being good or punished for being bad, but you can still derive good and bad.
Yeah, I don't think you need to be rewarded or punished. Morality is independent of reward or punishment. But yeah, I don't think you need a God to have objective morality at all. I don't think a God provides any basis of objective morality, and any existing
Well, to
law.
assess value,
What?
that you're saying that to assess value to human life, that you have to make. They say, okay, like there is a God, and there's objectively a value to human life because God said so. And so, if you're atheistic and you say like, well, there is no value to human life.
Well,
How
God's
are you
saying
going to how are
so.
you going to derive value to human life, even your own life, or let alone any life, to make some sort of system of good or bad based around?
Well, saying God said so, therefore you derive value is like saying, oh, there's a pineapple, therefore there's objective value. Like that's not actually an objective basis of value. For there to be an objective basis of value, there would need to be some kind of ontologically existent value thing, and we would need to have that property. So God saying
Like the
so
person is not the
doesn't
body.
work. What?
Yeah, so I mean the essential, like, because like I'm not my body, you are not your body,
It could be a
and
part of
the
your body. It
essential you
wouldn't make a
survives
difference.
death. And you're saying and like not only that, like the soul,
It
there's
doesn't.
karma and there's a
Surviving
God.
death doesn't matter. So you can, whether or not you survive death, there can still be morality. Whether or not there's a God, there can still be morality. God doesn't give you a basis of objective morality. Like just saying God
Or
says you have
materialism.
value
All right, some of the
doesn't.
dualistic values, okay, that the material realm, that like between this material of my flesh and the material of the computer, or something like that, to
What?
say because this is organic material, or even what we call alive, it is valuable. Um, how do you derive that?
What again? So any way you can derive that is better than God saying so. God saying so is not a correct way to derive that. It doesn't derive
Well, I
anything.
mean, God's saying that the way God made the system, it's factual, that there
It's
is a
not.
spiritual realm. The origin of our essence is not derivative from the material realm, and it's so to say indestructible, or that there's a karmatic factual, that karma is factual.
Yeah, that doesn't work. So it's simply saying
And I say
God
karma is
said
factual
so.
because God said so. And saying like that means the creator who created the system and the laws of nature
Yes,
creates
as
the
I've said
laws in the
six
way that.
times, that does not work. That literally just leads to the Euthyphro dilemma. God saying so does not make something
Well, I
an
didn't mean say so.
ontology.
I'm saying that karma is factual. You're saying that karma is factual. You just said karma is not
Like
factual, but
you
saying that.
can't derive value from God said so. That does not
Well,
work.
I mean, I'm just saying that God said so is just statement. God, like from the Bible, God said it and it
God
came to
chose
be.
to do something does not give you morality or value. Like that's
But I'm saying
deriving
it's the
morality from a
factual
potato.
nature of how the world works. That there is such a thing as karma. There is a spiritual realm. There is interaction between the material and spiritual realm,
Right, and
and
in that sense, we can just say there is a moral thing out there, a moral law out there. You don't need a God for that. You can just say there is a moral nature out there, and you don't need a God to have that.
my Stephen Grossberg book just came on the new book on neuroscience. But um, well, it's saying that I've talked about this with Church of Entropy and mentioned like classical atheist. You could be atheist in the Greek realm. Didn't mean what it means today, like a materialist. You could believe in a spiritual realm, in a material realm, and that there is a non-material soul. And being atheist meant you didn't believe in the deity, and like the deity in the temple had some sort of power, and just like someone like you're a materialist. How did the material realm come into being? And you have the Big Bang explanation, and some of the like panpsychism, maybe like I forget the name of the panpsychist you spoke to, Philip Goth, or something. You just be well, the same way the material realm came into being without reason, the spiritual realm came into being without being. But it was in that. I mean, just an interesting side note that you don't have to be. You could still be an atheist and believe in the spiritual realm and souls, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it just means you don't believe in a God or a creator.
Yep.
So I mean, I differentiate that, but a difference might be karma. that you could be an atheist. If you believe in a spiritual realm, in souls, it puts a different nature of the relationship between human action and good and bad, because there's some sort of separate realm to score what happens, and that can't be simply recorded in the material realm.
Well, all of that could be material. Like if any way, if karma could exist as given, like God created it, then karma could exist as a law of physics that just existed and you didn't need a God to create it. So none of those things would need to come from a God.
And from the materialist perspective, like utilitarianism, karma or good laws are a shared figment of people's imagination. That
No,
like you just like you could commit a crime and get away with it.
no, I'm talking about laws
Like,
of physics. It's like
but
literally
I'm
a
saying
law of
like
physics.
human law is not the law of physics. That's why you just said that people, you God forbid, rape and murder and get away with it because it's not a law of
Yeah,
physics.
yeah.
It's
So
a
I'm saying if karma existed, it doesn't. If it did, it could be a law of physics, in which case it wouldn't need to be created by a God. So even if karma existed, even though it doesn't need to be supernatural. It can be perfectly natural. It can be perfectly physical. A material law of nature like gravity. It could be a thing.
well, I agree with you on that, but I mean, just in terms of like hypothesis. So I mean, if you say there's a hypothesis that their karma exists and is mediated by the spiritual realm, and then there's another hypothesis that of a split between those of what's the origin of karma and the mediated spiritual realm, and so you say it's a deity, it's a God who created it, or you say that you don't have to believe that it's a deity or created it. But I'm saying from my school, I'm accepting both. I'm accepting that there's two realms and that there's a deity, and you're rejecting not only the deity, you're rejecting that there's two realms and karma.
So
But yet you're
you
still.
said, how do you derive morality without a God? And I said that any way morality could exist, like karma, could
Well, I
exist.
want to start with how do you derive value to life? I mean, even to start, I mean, do you need, does there have to be value to life to have morality?
No.
So I want to start with, how do you derive that there's value to life from a materialist perspective? Doesn't matter whether you die or not. Doesn't matter whether all of humanity dies or not.
No, I don't ascribe value to life. I describe value to choice, will. So if you don't want to live, then it's moral to die. So I don't think life itself has value. Consciousness has value.
Or I say, if my mind tells me that I want to live, or that life has value, but that's just a figment of my mind. It's not objective.
I think it is. I think it can be a law of nature, just like karma or whatever could exist. You don't need a God for that.
I didn't even get into this before, but even if we're talking like meeting of the mind, and one of the things I argued with Ben Watkins was that joint attention could also be better explained by dualism than materialism, let alone uh, karmatic joint attention. I mean, you talk like just pure, like we've been talking now for uh, 2.5 hours, and obviously, like joint attention seems somewhat factual. So from a materialist perspective, um, joint attention isn't really accurate. There's just what's happening in your mind, and there's happening what's in my mind. There's some sort of similarity that we could have communication, and you could call that like joint attention, like if we were on the same team playing basketball or something, and both of our eyes are on the ball, or even studies in monkeys or animals. I'm sure you've read some of the there's definite studies that joint attention, or being able to perceive what the other person is perceiving, um, from a purely physical perspective, and then to claim that okay, there's joint attention from a moralistic conception. Even in my mind, that's better explained by dualism. So say that me and you are in complete disagreement on dualism and the nature of the soul and karma, but let's say we both agree that like I don't steal, and let's say TJump him and maybe say, you don't steal, like even though you don't believe in God, or karma, like in that effect, because like trust me, I don't steal, like come in your house, I'm not going to steal your shit, it's not going to happen. That but what's the nature from your understanding of this joint attention of meeting of the minds, of to have some sort of moralistic system?
Well, I think morality is like you think it's karma. I think it's just a law of nature. So I don't think you need a God for any of that. You can derive it from the law of nature. Oh, I
When
don't.
yeah, that what does it mean if the mind is produced by the brain that me and you have joint attention now for 2.5 hours talking about abstract ideas?
I don't think
That
that
just like
has.
computers, like two separate computers running similar programs?
Sure.
Or is there like, I mean, so like from a spiritual, you say that there's some sort of joint phenomenon, and because my mind and your mind is not attached to our bodies, that joint attention is better explained by there's literally a meeting of the minds, that our immaterial minds are interacting on a non-material plane, the plane of ideas.
No, that doesn't count as an explanation. That's just making stuff up. It's clearly a better explanation that there's a material interaction that's similar, that is mirrored between the two brains. It's not. There's doesn't even count as an explanation to say dualism because it doesn't have any explanatory scope, has no explanatory power, has no supporting evidence, has never been demonstrated to have any parts that have been demonstrated to exist. Whereas physicalism has all of those things. So that's all
Or
better
the
explained
concept
by
of
physicalism.
Platonic forms. I mean, so like the circle doesn't exist. The circle exists in my mind and in your mind. And it's saying, so the circle is not a product of my mind and your mind. The circle is a factual form that exists in the spiritual realm in me and you. That's not that we're both using our mind to produce this abstract idea of the circle. So to say, we're both, uh, tapping into this form in another realm that is, these abstract ideas. Like, I mean, I assume that's Plato's argument of perfect circles for the spiritual realm.
Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. Again, there's no evidence for that. It's not supported by anything. All the evidence indicates, yes, it's our brains making stuff up.
But it goes
That's
back to mathematics. Where you skirted that issue earlier of
math
whether
is just a
mathematics was
representation
something
of the physical
spiritual.
world. So there's nothing spiritual about math. Math is just describing the way the physical world operates.
Well, it says presupposition. I mean, it cut somewhat for your objective morality. We could talk about on a scientific level of your, like, for scientific law to presuppose that there's universal rules. So I say, like, from a dualistic understanding, like Plato's argument of forms, is a universal rules don't exist in the material realm. They're superimposed on the material realm by a higher, different realm, the spiritual realm. And that's the basic Platonic argument for forms, and it's even structured as an argument against atheism. That if you could, kind of like the ontological argument, that if you could think of perfect circles, but there is no such thing as a perfect circle, but the idea of the perfect circle exists in our minds. Therefore, our mind, the perfect circle, must exist in the perfect spiritual realm. But to apply that towards some sort of explanation, said like joint attention, or the nature of higher order rules. How do you assume that the rules of science will always hold true? Like even the laws of physics, that even if it's predictable and it's happened every time, and therefore to say that it's a law, it's a governing principle of the material realm, as opposed to like it's a prediction that's held true, and we think that it will continue to hold true. But how can you have a materialist derivation of saying that there's a governing principle that prescribes all action?
Because reality is reality. And so, because reality is reality, the nature of reality itself deems that there are some things that hold universally and won't change. You don't need a God for that.
Well, saying that's the observed reality. He's saying that's not objective. He's saying that it's mind dependent. That
No. Reality is reality without minds. It's a mind independent.
He's saying like a computer has measured these things and independent of minds. That these computers have function on these rules applying in all cases without exception.
No, reality is just always reality. You don't need to measure that.
Well, any of the rules. I mean, so we're talking about moral rules that you're claiming that you could objectively derive moral rules. I mean, it kind of sound like um, Stephen Molyneux. I'm not sure the exact difference between your system and his
His
system.
is garbage, that's for one.
But I mean, you're saying something similar to what he's saying.
No, he
You're
says
saying
completely
that
different things. I did a complete review of his model. His
maybe I'll check that out. But I'm saying you are claiming the same claim that he's claiming. You just say
no,
that you're right and he's wrong.
no.
Or you're saying you claim something different.
He makes the claim that universally preferable beliefs are a thing because if you prefer anything, there must be a universal preferable belief. It has nothing to do with morality. He's not even making a moral claim. He
Yeah,
just
so
uses
I'm
the word.
starting with physical laws and saying that there could objectively be universal material laws or even logical laws that or any sort of laws, and then that I assume you would agree that first you should establish that to establish morality or something that's independent, that you could establish that there's such a thing as universal laws, period, let alone to establish universal moral laws.
Yeah, because laws are just fields, essentially. It's just a description of a field. So the reality is reality. It's just all of the fields in reality are themselves. And it's not because of any kind of abstract, non existing law. It's because that's just reality itself. It is a part of the nature of reality, which is a physical nature and nothing more. So there's nothing beyond the physical. All of those laws are just descriptions of the physical properties of nature itself. And they
So
could,
you're saying that it's not even a question that there's universal laws is not even a question to you that you don't see any um, problem with a materialistic view and universal laws.
nope, pretty easy. Reality is reality. It's only materially reality. It's still reality.
Like ether. Even the original scientists, Michelson and Morley, thought there had to be some sort of ether, and that you need some sort of superimposed system that sees to it that the laws are universal. And you're saying that
Nope. It's the nature of reality is the only thing that's forcing that to be the case. You don't need any kind of being to see to it that it's universal. It's like if it's a part of all reality, then it's going to be universal. Adam, thanks for the super chat. If karma is real, how come a shitty person like TJump keeps getting on more shekels? You're right, exactly.
well, judge you on your action. I'm saying, okay, relatively, saying judge a person on their action. Like, saying, like, God forbid, like, I hope you're not a rapist or a murderer. And saying, like, okay, you might be an atheist, um, but judge a person based on their action or repertoire being relatively nice to me. So, like, maybe you have to create some sort of objective standard for how you judge the morality of a person, and that may be belief independent. That I argue with people all the time. I say that beliefs aren't dangerous, and judge a person on their actions, not their beliefs. I'm not sure if you agree with that, or you think that. You say there's some connection between beliefs and actions, but like, I have friends of all sorts, and I judge them on their track record of action, not their beliefs. In fact, I find it interesting to have friends of different beliefs.
Yeah, I don't think beliefs can be immoral at all. I think only actions are. Were there any other arguments or evidence that you think are evidence of a god?
Well, I say evidence is a tough word, but it's saying that I think it's worldview in these various explanatory power. So, I said that we talked about a whole bunch of things, and maybe at some point we're going in circles, but I think that was the basic thing that I was trying to say. That I think there's a lot of uncertainty. The greatest minds of all generations have been debating this, and I don't think we're going to resolve it. Even like what you said about the hard problem of consciousness, that I'm predicting that there's not going to be any big breakthroughs on that, and you're predicting there is going to be some sort of breakthroughs, and time will see. Um, and we covered a lot of the metaphysics of like morality to even um, objective higher order rules. But like, we're both streamers, so audience will decide. I didn't think I was going to change your mind. I don't think you probably didn't assume you were going to change my mind, but I appreciate interesting conversation. As I even encourage Jennifer to work together with you in that sense of you're a good streamer, intellectual, talking about these ideas in a serious manner. So appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Hop on the Discord and chat with Jen sometime, and talk to you later.
Okay, yeah, appreciate it. Good luck at the the IRL show, and hopefully that takes off. Maybe you'll be the next
Dawkins.
I don't Dawkins or something, like traveling around the world. And I saw you joked about Jennifer calling her Deepak Chopra, and
Yep.
when I debated JF, I used his lectures, and I thought he did better than your typical Judeo-Christians, actually. And so I incorporated a lot, and I even think Arjun and Siddharth did better with some of those Vedic arguments. I've been incorporating Eastern philosophy into that. So so maybe we'll meet again on the intellectual battlefield.
For sure. I'm gonna get some coffee. Need to go to the bathroom too. So again, thanks again for coming on. Oh, do you want to like give anybody a link to where they can find you? You said you stream.
Yeah, I have a channel, doooovid, that I have public study sessions and some informative things. I've done research and IRL activity in Detroit. Like I mentioned, I first started out teaching people like how to chant Hebrew prayers, interfaith. A lot of the, like I do interfaith for years, and listening to various people of belief patterns that made me think about these things on a deeper level. Also, like dualism, trying to understand what people believe, and a lot of it requires thinking from their perspective, and under my own tradition, which is why defending dualism. But my main streaming is just my weekly week in review with Church of Entropy every Sunday night. That we've known it a few years now, and basically we teamed up from different backgrounds, different parts of the world, because we both kind of wanted to defend spiritualism and various ideas like reincarnation, and I guess she's a monist. So every Sunday night we can review 7 p.m. Eastern time.
Awesome. Thanks again.